Waiting for someone, friend?
I'm minding my own concerns.
That be sharp of you, brother. It never does a man to do otherwise, I say.
Pierce pulled the cloak open to reveal the worn midshipman's coat, and the man's eyes opened in mock surprise.
Why, you's navy, and here's us wondering what you was about.
Who was wondering? There was a clear glint of avarice then. The smile broadened, and the hand came out, empty, from under his coat.
There's one or two round here it would be unwise to trust. Happen you need a bit of help to see what's going on around you, mate.
And you're just the fellow to oblige.
Tom Watts at your service. There's many a sailor boy have been pleased to have me show them the ropes.
Watts laughed out loud and repeated his pun.
Show them the ropes! Sailor boys, just smoke it!
Tom, I am standing here waiting for someone because I am too poor to go inside. Should I do so, I would be obliged to purchase something for which I lack the means to pay. So I think that you might be wasting your time.
Ah, that offends, friend. An offer to help is just that.
Said with mock anger, it nevertheless hit home, for Tom was already moving back.
As you say, Tom, but I think we would both profit more from being left alone.
That little exchange brought home to Pierce once more what little he had in the way of prospects, and certainly he had no means of elevating himself to become the kind of person who could take revenge on those murderers across the Channel. It was all very well entertaining a fantasy of rising to become a powerful man, but that was all it would stay. Being the son of a radical orator did not fit you for much. In fact, it positively debarred him from certain routes to the kind of goal he sought. He had something of an education, but, besides being incomplete, in what? A smattering of Latin and Greek, an incomplete knowledge of the classics, the ability to ride well and wield a sword was hardly the basis of any kind of career, and certainly not enough to equip him to apply for a profession. The law was too expensive, and he would require a high degree of learning, which he did not possess at present and lacked the means to acquire in the immediate future. Medicine held no appeal, although he was convinced that even totally ignorant he could probably get by as a doctor given the number of charlatans who passed themselves off in that field. Teaching was another option. He had enough learning for that, especially in French, but quite apart from the fact that they earned a pittance, he had bad memories of the schools he had attended, and the kind of people that taught in them. Miserable sods who were sore-headed in the morning, drunk in the afternoon, and very fond of the birch cane as a teaching aid. He could follow in the parental footsteps. The name Adam Pierce would open certain doors, except he had none of the conviction that had sustained his father over the years. Besides that, he longed to clear himself in the eyes of the only friends he felt he had in the world. Right now, Colborne was the sole person who could provide him with an avenue, however tenuous, to do that, for they were on the ship and might never be allowed ashore while the war lasted. Maybe the Navy would assuage that desire for revenge he felt by giving him a chance to strike back at the French in some small way. He had no mind to be a soldier. That was known to be worse than being a sailor, unless you were an officer, and that required the means to buy a commission. He had even thought about the idea of a sum of prize money that would set him up, before reminding himself, as he had sought to relay to others, that such notions were in the realms of a pipe dream. These depressing thoughts ceased as the lieutenant came up the high street from the Commodore's house, head thrust forward, trailing the usual following of grubby boys, cupped hands out, one persistently asking for a penny, another for a halfpenny, the most desperate for a farthing. He almost felt a kindred spirit to them.
Even if your return is fortuitous, I have no real notion that I want you back aboard my ship.
They were inside now, sat at a table waiting for the food that had been ordered, each man with a flagon of cider in his hand. Pierce, who had failed to mention that he could not pay, longed to ask why his presence was fortuitous, but he sensed that would not help his cause. "I will come back aboard as a common seaman."
"You will not!" Colborne exclaimed. "If I allow you back on board at all, it will be in the rank with which you departed, that of a volunteer. Then at least the Navy won't have to pay you, and nor will you get a chance to undermine the crew."
Hope, thought Pierce. He is thinking of agreeing.
"If that damn fool Bailey had not broken his leg, I would not even consider it."
Colborne responded to the inquiring look.
"He fell out of the rigging, fortunately from not too great a height. So you see I am short of a body, even a fairly useless one, to run the ship."
Pierce posed his next question with some trepidation. "I was given to understand that a queue of boys existed who would do anything to get into the Navy."
"Not aboard the Griffin," Colborne snapped. "I even asked the Commodore for a suggestion. He said, and I quote his attempt to be jocose, that he could think of no person he disliked enough."
Then he looked hard at Pierce and asked,
"Why?"
"I will not lie to you. I am at stand, and the way I left Griffin still makes me uncomfortable."
"The notion that you are stymied makes me content. In fact, I can recall the moment you allude to, and the fact that I thoroughly enjoyed it."
Pierce felt his opinion of Colborne shifting, though in truth it had been dented on their last parting. He had seen him as rather soft, easy-going, perhaps with a sense of humour, but experience had shown that he had his own way of dealing with things, and a devious mind to boot. And there was an air of malice in his responses that Pierce had never thought to see. "Might I ask if the crew is less disgruntled?" That touched a nerve, for Colborne spat a reply.
"The crew will do what is required of them."
Perhaps things have not settled after all, Pierce thought. Would telling him the story of how his father had died and how he had witnessed it provoke sympathy, enough to aid the case? It was possible, but he did not want to reprise it. He had dreamt about it too often these last 2 weeks, woken from his nightmare to curse himself as a coward for not even endeavouring to attempt a rescue. He should have tried and died in the process, and that he failed to do so would haunt him for the rest of his life. "In truth, Mr. Colborne, at this moment, I have nowhere else to go, and it pains me to tell you that I do not even have the means to pay for the food we have ordered." That quite visibly surprised the lieutenant, who suddenly covered the lower half of his face with his cider tankard, holding it there longer than the time taken for a gulp.
"I can pay for your dinner."
"Thank you." There was another pause of the kind that all men make when faced with a decision they would rather avoid. Then Colborne allowed himself a slight smile, as though he had just had a notion that amused him.
"I will grant you 1 voyage. In that time you must show me that my kindness is not misplaced. You must also show me that you have the ability to command those men who were your former shipmates."
Pierce could not resist the thought that Colborne was toying with him once more, and he would have liked to have declined. But since he had no choice, he was forced to say, "Thank you again."
"The correct form of address, Mr. Pierce, is thank you, sir."
The looks he got when he arrived at the quayside almost made his prior action worthwhile, which felt very much like grovelling. In no position to say anything, the boat crew had to look at him once more, this time their faces blank masks, to let him know the opposite of what was the truth, that they were near dying of curiosity. Alongside Griffin, a flat-bottomed hoy was pumping fresh water aboard. This, while a barge disgorged bundles of wood to feed the ship's stoves and the cook's coppers. Off the stern, another party was hoisting in sacks of fresh bread, dried peas and oatmeal, and barrels of beer, salt beef and pork, these being lowered through a hatch to the holds. The cry of "Griffin" from the coxswain to let those aboard ship know that their captain was coming aboard did little to disturb the work. The men necessary to see Colborne aboard, the quartet of Marines and Midshipman Short, had changed from working clothes to proper uniform the minute they had seen the boat put off from the shore, this told to them by a ship's boy set at the masthead for that purpose. Pierce had no idea who it was who spotted and identified him, but all labour ceased in an instant, every eye on the approaching boat with several hands outstretched and pointing fingers. The roar of a petty officer's voice, heavy with cursing, got them working again, but not at the previous pace. Every action was made in the light of the need to keep an eye on John Pierce. Colborne was piped aboard to the stamp of marine boots, and Pierce, as he followed, was gifted the sight of Midshipman Short's lined old face in deep shock, this while his jaw worked to find the words he should say. Finally, taking his hat from his head, they came out as a croak.
"Welcome aboard, sir."
Colborne lifted his own hat to what passed for the quarterdeck, an act which had Pierce doing the same, as he recalled that it was what officers did on coming aboard ship. A ripple of exclamation, gasps, and damnations swept the deck, that followed by another bellow from the petty officer to get working.
"Mr. Short," said Colborne, "as you know, I rated Mr. Pierce as a gentleman volunteer prior to his departure from the ship."
"Sir."
"He is now rejoining to replace Mr. Bailey."
There was obviously an inquiry in the captain's look, for Short responded,
"Shipped ashore, sir, to the hospital. I have been told to expect him to be unable to resume his duties for some 6 weeks, and he has asked me to ask you if he has permission to go home and convalesce with his family." 6 weeks, Mr. Pierce. You might last more than one voyage after all."
It could not have been staged, but it certainly felt like it,
for those words were, as usual, heard by everyone.
It was almost as if Colborne was telling the crew to give him a hard time. Pierce remembered that slight, amused smile before Colborne consented to take him aboard. He thought now he understood it.
"Please return to your duties, Mr. Short, while I outline to Mr. Pierce his. After all, he is a complete novice. I will write Mr. Bailey's permission to go home. It can go ashore with one of the supply vessels."
All trooped below, Short and the Marines to change back into working gear, Pierce trailing Colborne to his so-called cabin. The captain stopped between the 2 layers of hanging canvas.
"You may put your possessions, such as they are, in where Mr. Bailey berthed, and treat it as your own. I am sure he will have no objection to you using those things he has left behind. The most important will be his books on seamanship. I suggest you make a deep study of those."
In his cabin, Colborne continued, sitting himself, but not inviting his new midshipman to do the same, so Pierce was forced to stand, head bowed, legs well spread and uncomfortable.
"Once we sail, you will share watches with Mr. Short, 4 hours on and 4 off. I will take the deck at dawn each day, and I will wish the ship to be cleared for action just before that. You will keep the ship on the course I have set, and do no more than alert me should you sight another vessel, apprehend any threat, or feel that the state of the weather requires my presence on deck. Now I suggest you go on deck and supervise some of the loading of stores."
Pierce put as much effort into his "Aye, aye, sir," as he could. Probably futile, he was determined to show Colborne that his petty malice had no effect. Busy getting out the materials to write a letter, the man did not even notice. Pierce stood at the bottom of the companionway ladder for a moment, looking around what had once been his quarters, and half regretting the fact that it was no longer the case, steeling himself for what he knew was likely to be a hostile reception. At all costs, he must get Michael O'Hagan alone. If he could explain to the Irishman and convince him that he had had no choice, then Michael would bring round the rest of the crew. The other thing he determined was that while he was aboard he would carry out his duties as scrupulously as he could, giving neither Colborne nor the rest of the hands any excuse to regret his being there. Taking a deep breath, he began to climb. There was banter on the deck, there always was when this kind of duty was being performed, as one tar would jocosely insult another for laziness, looks, the pox, or some other perceived fault. It died completely, as did the work, the moment Pierce's head emerged from the hatchway. More telling was the fact that no one looked in his direction. Any inadvertent eye was quickly turned away. That and the quiet manner, as opposed to the previous shouts, by which they were told to resume the proper level of labour. Pierce headed for Short, who was, in all probability, his superior. He would have to share a berth with him, albeit they would rarely be in situ at the same time. "Mr. Short, where would you like me to be?" The look on that preternaturally aged face, and the glare that went with it, was as good as the man saying, "Hell." But he had responsibility, and that overrode his personal desires. "They are loading victuals aft. Take charge of the party there, and see to it that what is sent below is properly stowed." Pierce heard the rumble as he made to oblige. Even in harbour the ship pitched on a slight swell, and whoever had dislodged it had timed it well, for as it grew louder he had to turn to look. Then he had to jump, quick, for the cannonball was very close to his ankle, rolling by to come up against the rim of the hatchway. Slowly Pierce bent down and picked it up, turning and holding it in his hand. Not one eye was aimed in his direction. Everyone was busy. Then, slowly, he walked towards the bows, looking for the garland from which it had been taken, seeing one missing from the 9-pounder furthest forward. Carefully he placed it back where it belonged, and as he straightened he caught the look of one of his shipmates. It was that of Michael, and it was a look filled with what appeared to be a deep loathing. The very tactic that Pierce had visited on Lieutenant Colborne was, on that duty, now being applied to him. In charge of loading the rest of the stores, he would issue an order, and it would be obeyed, but at a pace designed to show him just how he stood in the estimation of the crew. It did not help that he had to ask advice regarding the proper storage of the casks, which led to a string of derogatory remarks, all loud enough to reach his ears. Any hope he had of talking to the Pelicans was nullified by the fact that they stayed as far away from him as possible, working on the deck of the store-ship rather than their own. As the hands were being piped to dinner, he made his way below, passing through the crew quarters to get to the screened-off den that was now his, which exposed him to hissed curses and no shortage of jostling. Charlie Taverner and Rufus Dommett refused to meet his eye, not something Michael was prepared to do, though, given the look, Pierce wished he would. The dinner he ate was no better than that he had been given before, and in short he had a companion who, either from suspicion or dislike, was good for no more than an occasional grunt in conversation, this in a berth so cramped that he almost longed for the crush he had known previously. Then it was back on deck to complete the victualling of the ship, this work carried out with more of a will. That had nothing to do with Midshipman Pierce and his ability to issue orders, more to do with the fact that the boats would be coming out from shore again, and the men were keen to pretty themselves up for the visit. Colborne clearly had no notion to witness the debauchery, for he called for his boat to go ashore. He would have to come back, for he was obliged by standing orders to sleep aboard, but he would, no doubt, time his return for when things had quieted somewhat. Short, once work was completed and they were back below, did actually speak to him on the matter of forthcoming arrangements. Nothing more galling than his assumption of agreement. "You will appreciate, Pierce, that Bailey was too young to have an interest in the fair sex." Pierce just nodded, having a very good idea of what was coming. "That would not, of course, apply to you, would it?" Pierce looked up from his seat on Bailey's sea-chest. Not very far up for sitting, he was nearly the same height as his new messmate, conjuring up as he did so an image of the whores he had seen ashore, which did nothing to cheer him, for it would be they or their ilk coming out to service the crew tonight. "I do have an interest in the fair sex, Mr. Short, but it is not an appellation I would apply to the females who are presently going to come aboard. In them I have no interest whatsoever." That brought an expression to Short's face which could only be described as thwarted, and it was with some feeling that he said,
Beggars can't be choosers.
Then I am happy to admit to not being a beggar.
It is the question of room, Pierce,
Short insisted, looking round their hutch.
You do understand that a fellow has needs, and a degree of decent privacy is necessary when they are—
He could not finish the sentence, but then he did not have to. If I had somewhere else to go, Mr. Short, I would oblige you. But as I do not, and as I have no desire to share the pleasures you no doubt anticipate, I intend to sling a hammock and try to get some sleep. Short's little old face screwed up with frustration.
That is damned uncooperative, Pierce. I should think that someone already in bad odour with the crew—
Would conclude, Pierce interrupted, that it makes no odds if that is extended. The look Short gave him just before he spun round and made his exit was deeply malevolent, and Pierce wondered if he had been wise to be so intransigent, for he would, very likely, need advice from this dwarf if he was to carry out his duties. That was until he reminded himself that he really did have no choice, apart from spending the night on the open deck, hardly an enticing prospect since, given the overcrowding aboard, that was likely to be a scene of much carnal activity. His few possessions, sextant, shaving implements, flints, he placed on the available shelves, including a small tin he had purchased to hold that paper-wrapped earth he had taken from his father's graveside. Then, on second consideration, he decided to keep the tin on his person, to remind him of the cause he must pursue. In his pocket he could touch it constantly, and perhaps draw from it resolve, if not strength. When he did rig his hammock and climb in, he found himself, with so little space, staring at his own knees. At least when he opened Bailey's copy of The Seaman's Vade Mecum, it was resting in the right place to read, that is, if the light from the guttering lantern had been any good. He heard the scrape of boats coming alongside and feet on the deck as the tribe of money-grasping nocturnals came aboard. That was the least of the noise, which increased in pitch as time wore on. There was a fiddler scratching a tune, probably for a penny of which he was unworthy. Squeals of female laughter mingled with screams, some happy, others angry and vicious, and he tried to blot from his imagination the scene beyond the screen at his feet and what was happening above his head on deck. The canvas that cut him off from the passage to Colborne's cabin was hauled back more than once, and he found himself looking into faces of supreme ugliness, of whores who were still looking for a trick, or eager to service more than one tar. Finding that a polite refusal was insufficient, he roared at them to get out, which they did, leaving behind them aspersions on his manhood and his probable inclinations. Sleep did come, but not quickly and only through sheer exhaustion, and even that was disturbed by a drunken Short trying to rig his hammock and the noise of the captain coming back on board. So it was a very groggy John Pierce who stood to, as ordered, at dawn. That being the point at which the tide favoured a departure from Lymington, he had another task to perform, to get the women off the ship, and to ensure that no illicit drink was left behind, which was not an action to raise the standing of even a popular officer. It was also an occasion when he found out that dealing with harpies made the most truculent sailor look easy. They screamed, they cursed, they tried to bite, scratch, and hit him. That was when they were not trying to grab him in the crotch and inviting him to slip into a hammock and enjoy himself. With the last of the spitting harridans over the side, it was time to unmoor the ship. The attitude of the crew was the same as the loading, this not aided by the state of their heads, for every one of them had been very drunk the night before from banned spirits brought aboard by the women. The fact that he was merely relaying instructions from the captain made no odds, and Colborne, who could not fail to observe the way he was ignored, declined to intervene, except to embarrass him further.
"Mr. Pierce, you really must get the men about their duties. Establish your authority, for heaven's sake. You have my permission to start any man who is tardy."
There was nothing he could say. He was damned if he was going to become a tyrant, and he lacked the means to persuade, so he had to fall back on the only course left open to him, to do things himself, which would have been fine if he had known what he was about. Apart from a bit of gun practice and shroud climbing, all he had ever done aboard ship was haul on a rope or hump a barrel. Certainly, aboard the merchantman, the Lady Harrington, observation had shown him much, but the Navy was different. Everything must be done quickly, and paying attention to such duties as hauling in the mooring cable left him unsighted when anyone sought to goad him. Stepping back, he tripped on a small cask left there precisely for that purpose. He landed heavily, but one hand was put out to help him up, that of the old salt Latimer. There was no kindness in the look or the words that accompanied it.
"You'd best find yourself another occupation, mister, for we're going to be in deep water soon, and that is no place to be unpopular on a dark and noisy night."
"Even if I earn your respect?" Michael O'Hagan, like the other pelicans, was close enough to hear and reply to that.
"Sure, hell will freeze over first."
"Why did you ever come back aboard?" demanded Rufus, his young freckled face looking truly hurt.
"Don't ask him that,"
snarled Charlie Taverner.
"He'll only lie to you like he did before."
"Mr. Pierce, is that mooring cable going to sully my deck much longer? Let's get it stowed away."
"You heard the man, lads. Now you can decline the duty, and Ha'penny will punish you just so you like me a little less."
"Impossible," said Latimer. But he went on, "Let's get it stowed. Be hard to have your grog stopped just so Coal Barge can bait this bugger. I needs a hair of the dog."
As they set to, like proper seamen, Colborne could not resist another jab, little knowing that it was to be inimical to his intention.
"I see you have the measure of them, Mr. Pierce. Well done. I think you can come aft and join me on the quarter-deck now, where I am sure we can begin your nautical education."
It was the sailor called Matt who spoke then, bent over hauling the slimy cable as Pierce walked away, a perplexed expression on his round face.
"But in right here, lads. If we's baiting Pierce, why is Coal Barge at it as well?"
"Who says he's baiting him?" asked Rufus.
"Can anyone lend this boy a brain, 'cause sure as hell he ain't got one?"
"Could say the ship's at one, mate," said Charlie.
"Then it'll be the first I ever sailed on." "You've got a point there, Matt," said Latimer, a look of deep curiosity on his lined, weather-beaten face.
Pierce approached Colborne and asked, "Sir, do you think it aids the efficiency of the ship if you undermine me?"
"Mr. Pierce, I have no idea what you are talking about, quite apart from the fact that you are at this moment so useless that the greatest threat to the efficiency of the ship resides in your person. Now be so good as to prepare the signal gun. Even you must be aware that it is the custom on departure to salute the Commodore's flag."
The gunner was already there, with his light charges ready, and the gun boomed out to be replied to from the shore in what to Pierce's mind was just a waste of powder. Then they were beyond the harbour mouth, albeit not yet fully at sea, but the ship began to lift and drop in that familiar way, with Pierce suddenly wondering if the seasickness which had afflicted him when he had crossed the channel in that fishing smack would come back to haunt him. Right now that was the last thing he needed. At least the sun was shining, and it was a clear spring day as Colborne put his helm down once they'd cleared the narrow estuary and headed southwest down the Solent. Within the hour they were passing the Needles, the pinnacles of weather-hammered chalk standing clear and imposing at the southern tip of the Isle of Wight. Colborne stayed on deck throughout, for this was a busy shipping lane, especially for warships standing in for Portsmouth and the Spithead anchorage. Because he was there and the petty officers were seeing to the various tasks that needed to be carried out, mainly clearing the deck from the mess it had been after the previous day and night to what it needed to be at sea, Pierce could relax. Easy as he was, he listened to every command that the captain gave, watched how he set the sail, took cognizance of the fact that he often went to the ship's side and looked at the colour of the water, making minor adjustments to account for the currents. They passed a patrolling frigate, a vessel that had the unenviable duty of guarding the Solent approaches, a task even less exciting than that on which HMS Griffin was engaged. He had time to think, too. The first notion being a question. Was he really cut out for this life? The second was more alarming, as he began to understand just how little he knew. There was the setting of sails, the stowing of the ship's stores, blocks and tackles, ropes, knots, navigation, gunnery, all a mystery. He recalled the mids aboard HMS Brilliant, how they seemed as ignorant as he was now, and presumably both Colborne and Barclay had started in the same way. They had learnt, and so must he, and now he had the advantage that at any time, once they touched shore, he could walk off the ship and bid the whole business goodbye.
"Mr. Pierce, you must not stand and daydream so. You may not be aware that I can, at any time I wish, withdraw your status as a volunteer and reduce you to a common seaman. So I suggest, when you do not have an immediate task in hand, you put yourself to study. For tonight you will be alone on this deck in sole charge of the ship."
It was eerie on deck, not entirely alone, but with only a quartermaster and his mate manning the wheel, on a pitch-black, moonless night, with the wind steady over the stern to starboard. It felt strange. Colborne had set the course, and it was chalked on a slate under the binnacle lantern, registered on the compass above that, and he had no power to change it. Not that he wanted to. He had no clear idea where they were going now, so he would have even less of one if it was altered. He assumed that they were heading for the same waters where Griffin had taken that privateer, there to cruise in the hope of intercepting another. But no one had bothered to enlighten him. His sole task was to turn the half-hour glass and order the bell to be rung so that anyone awake would know the time. After 8 bells, he would retire and hand over the deck to Midshipman Short. Alone with his thoughts, he sniffed at the night air, wondering if he would ever be in a position, as he had heard others claim, to smell the approach of bad weather. What he did know was, steady as the wind seemed to be, it was not constant, that there were flukes of change, slight but noticeable, and there were cross-currents in the waters beneath the hull that rendered slightly uneven the pitch and roll of the ship. But the only sound, apart from the whistle of the wind through the rigging, was the creak of ropes as the quartermaster carried out minor adjustments to keep steady the compass needle. Those ropes ran through Colborne's sleeping quarters, which made Pierce wonder how the man ever got any rest. Isolated in darkness, with nothing really to do, it was easy to sink into a near comatose state, so the first rumble made him jump. But the dull thud as the cannonball hit the side was unmistakable. That soon followed by another rumble as the ball was shifted by the pitch of the ship. Peering forward, he could see nothing, but he knew it was a problem with which he would have to deal, for if he did not, it would go on and on. It was the kind of noise designed to wake everyone on board. He knew that from his own shot-rolling, and it would keep them awake as well. Stepping forward beyond the binnacle, it was even darker. He could see nothing at all, not the side of the ship, the shrouds, or the gun carriages. But he could hear the cannonball, though fixing it by sound alone was impossible. Pierce suddenly crouched down, hands out in front of him, in a forlorn hope that the damned thing would oblige him by trundling in the right direction. The swift movement of air just above his head removed his hat but missed his head, and he heard a muttered curse as he instinctively rolled sideways, ramming into a gun carriage and jarring his shoulder. The pain of that he would feel later. Right now he had someone in the Stygian blackness who could seemingly see better than he, and was trying to brain him. Whatever had removed his hat had been solid enough for the purpose. Safety lay on the quarterdeck, by that binnacle lantern, but whoever had tried to clout him would know that, so he moved slightly towards the prow, which placed his assailant in silhouette. Pierce could not see much, an indistinct shape, an arm raised with the outline of a marlinspike, but it gave him some idea of where to aim. The temptation to shout out was huge, but he resisted it. Would the quartermaster or his mate leave the wheel to come to his aid anyway? He was damn sure no one would come from below for that purpose. There was no clear process of thought. He just knew he had to deal with this himself, and using the gun carriage he hauled himself to his feet and kicked out, feeling the toe of his shoe make contact. Now his attacker was right between him and the light, and Pierce belted him with a swift jab to the head that hit bone and hurt his knuckles. That followed up by another kick that landed on something, and the silhouette disappeared. That damned cannonball rumbled again, coming aft and getting louder. If it came quickly enough to hit in the right spot, it was enough to break a bone or two, and the confusion about what to do gave his assailant the time he needed to get away. There was no more than a sliver of faint light as the hatch lid lifted and dropped, but it was enough to let Pierce know that, barring the rolling shot, he was in no more danger.
"On the wheel there! Get a lantern lit and fetch it forward!"
Seeing no movement, Pierce lost his temper and shouted in a way to ensure that any soul who could sleep through shot-rolling would wake now.
"Damn you, man! Do as I say and do it at the double!"
The effect was gratifying, even if, with his anger subsiding, he felt slightly foolish. The quartermaster's mate used the binnacle flame to light an oil lantern and came forward gingerly. It held high above his head, during which time Pierce had got himself, by feel alone, behind one of the gun carriages. It took no time at all, once the tiny deck was lit, to find and secure the cannonball, at which point Pierce resumed his position with both men back on the wheel, and now that it was quiet again, he could think over what had just happened, on the level of that threat and how he was going to have to deal with it.
"The glass, Mr. Pierce. It needs turning," said the quartermaster.
It was a sheepish Pierce who replied, "How many bells? I've forgotten."
7.
The way the man audibly sighed as he replied was strangely reassuring, for it indicated to Pierce that he had no idea of what had happened in the darkness beyond the binnacle, and that seemed to imply whoever had attacked him was not doing so on behalf of the whole crew. He might be wrong, of course, clutching at straws, but it made him feel good to believe it, for the alternative, with 3 weeks at sea, was deadly. The sand ran through the glass one more time before a grumpy and uncommunicative Short came up to relieve him. But he waited for a bit before he made his way to his hammock, for just as the watch changed on deck, so it would below, with half the men being turned out of their hammocks so as to be ready to work the ship should that be necessary. When he did descend the companionway, he was forced, by the lack of room, to crawl under sleeping bodies, every nerve tingling, for all would know where he was going at this time, and anyone who wished him ill, either awake or just pretending to be asleep, would have another opportunity to attack him. He was up with everyone else before first light, in command of the larboard guns as Colborne swept the increasingly defined surroundings. Not that it was clear. Heavy cloud and a grey sea made the point at which the sky ceased and water began indistinct. But it was empty, so the guns could be housed and the naval day could commence with the cleaning of the decks. Pierce was examining every man as they carried out their duties of wetting, sanding, sweeping and flogging, looking for signs of a limp or a bruise to the head. He was also looking for the furtive glance in his direction that would indicate a conspirator. He naturally paid particular attention to his pelicans, and was relieved that they did not look at him at all. Then he saw Gerson rub his lower leg, and noticed that the bandana he was wearing was tied a lot lower than normal. So perhaps there was a bruise under there. That, however, set off a train of thought. Gerson was a pest, but he was malleable, a crawler, an easy man to persuade to undertake the task of braining Pierce, and coward enough to wait until dark to do it. As far as he knew, he had betrayed him to Colborne for little more than the captain's gratitude, and he would do the same for another. That begged the question of who put him up to it, because with his previous behaviour of interfering with Pierce's possessions, it could again be Colborne. A doubtful scenario, for there was no logic in it, but one that had to be considered. So were there others who had put the sod up to it? Who were they? And did they have the intention of making another attempt, this time by somebody more competent?
"Pipe the hands to breakfast," said Colborne,
at which point Pierce moved close to him so that the exchange would not be overheard. "Permission to address the crew, sir?" Colborne's eyebrows shot up.
"Address the crew, Mr. Pierce? I do believe that is a captain's prerogative."
"I suspected it would be, sir, but I have something I wish to say to them that may well increase the efficiency of the ship."
"No more rolling shot?"
That was Colborne's first acknowledgment of the fact that he had heard it. "More than that."
"Believe me, Mr. Pierce, that is enough. You may address the hands below as they take their breakfast. I will not oblige you by assembling them on deck."
"That suits me, sir, and with your permission I will close the hatch. I have no mind to let either you or Mr. Short hear what I have to say." He would listen, of course he would, but he would not say so, and the knowledge that he would eavesdrop stopped him from checking Pierce for words that were definitely insubordinate. Waiting till all the men were finishing their breakfast, Pierce slipped down the hatch and closed it behind him, amused because the sound of feet moving forward was clearly audible. He stopped on the bottom rung, as Colborne had done that first day aboard, and looked at the crew, waiting till they, made curious by his staying where he was, stared at him.
"Right," Pierce said. "I'm going to say something to you all, and be assured there will be no repetition. I don't expect you to like me."
"Never fear that, mate,"
said a low, hidden voice, which he recognized as that of Blubber.
"Nor do I care if you respect me, but I will, from now on, when I am on watch in the dark, have close to me a pistol, primed and loaded. So if anyone is thinking of repeating last night's little escapade, be warned.
It is a weapon I know how to use." His eyes ranged over the group, looking for the reaction, trying to see who they were that would happily kill him, and how many. Gerson was looking at the deck, but everyone else was giving him a stare to equal his own, not friendly, but not guilty either, more the look of folk wondering what the hell he was on about, which made him question if he had made a misjudgment. Could Gerson have acted on his own?
"Apart from 3 of your number, I have no loyalty to you, which means I owe you nothing."
"Is this another story, Pierce?" demanded Latimer.
"If you don't know now what the storytelling was about, ask Michael over there, for he will tell you. Or Gerson, who stole a letter from my ditty bag."
"That's a lie!" Not a head turned at that, so Pierce had no idea if they believed him or not.
"I did it for my own reasons, and for my own reasons I am a midshipman aboard this ship. I am telling you here and now that if I am given the responsibilities of an officer, I will act like one. I have no mind to spend the whole voyage either watching my back or getting myself dirty doing the work you are supposed to carry out. I will, if I have to, report you to the captain for punishment."
"Man turns easy,"
said Latimer.
"Don't bait me."
"Why is Colebarge at the same game, Pierce?" asked Matt.
"He's enjoying himself. Every time you torment me it gives him pleasure, for that is what I did to him when I was last aboard. Anyway, I have said my piece and I will say no more."
Blubber again.
"Thank Christ for that."
Pierce ignored him, taking it as just a standard reaction. Instead, he looked right at O'Hagan.
"Michael, I want you, Rufus, and Charlie on deck now. I have something to say to you."
Charlie opened his mouth with the clear intention of saying no, but Pierce cut him off.
"And that, I'm sorry to say, is an order."
Waiting in the bows, Pierce was never sure what brought them up. Not fear, for sure. More likely curiosity. And perhaps the other crew members had goaded them out of the same sentiment. The way they approached was almost amusing, the walk of each trying to send him the message that they were his equal. Michael carried it off with ease, Charlie with a swagger that was too obvious to be anything other than an act, Rufus tried to look as if he was tough, and ended up looking like a fool. Behind them Gerson came on deck, until Pierce called out, "Go below, or I'll rip that bandana off your head and have a look at what you're hiding underneath it." No more proof was required that Gerson was the culprit. He shot below like a scalded cat, leaving Pierce looking at three faces in various expressions of distrust. "I want to say I'm sorry, and explain." "You'd need to be more than sorry," said Taverner. "Then I don't know what that is, Charlie. Beyond a sorry and meant, there is nothing." "Talk," said Michael. "I would not want you to turn around, but if you did, you would see Lieutenant Colborne staring at us. And I think it won't be long before he asks what we're about, so—" Pierce wondered as he spoke, not for the first time in his life, why explanations always sounded like excuses, even when they were true. Try as he might to find a tone in his voice that would convey the veracity of his words, he could not do it, and nothing on the faces of the trio of men before him led him to believe that he was succeeding, for their expressions remained blank. The trap was sprung on me, and Colborne was clever in his timing, leaving me no margin to include any of you. I had to decide between you three, who faced no threat, and my father, who faced a very real one. "We only have your word for that," said Charlie. "It was real, Charlie. I found out when I got to London that he had been imprisoned in Paris. That's where I've been." "Oh, don't tell me you went and rescued him. The hero Pierce." "No, Charlie, though I wanted to." "You went all the way there?" asked Rufus, his eyes open in wonder. "He was my father, my only relative living, so what choice did I have? I found him in his cell." "Was?" Pierce, as he looked at Michael, felt the tears well up once more in his eyes, felt again that sensation of not knowing if they were caused by grief or self-pity.
10 days ago, they took my father in a cart from a prison called the Conciergerie in Paris to a square called the Place de la Révolution. Michael was ahead of him, and his malice evaporated. He had obviously picked up the catch in the voice, and he could not fail to see the wetness around Pierce's eyes. He put a gentle hand on his forearm. There, with a crowd who had no idea of his name screaming for his blood, he was, like a dozen other poor innocents, strapped to a board, and his head was cut off. "John, boy," said Michael, "we need no more." "You do, Michael, you do, for I was there, in the crowd. I saw it happen. And you know, Michael, I did nothing." "Mr. Pierce, I am wondering what you are doing, loitering in the bows with those fellows." "I will get you off this ship, I promise, all three of you. I owe you that." "How do we know I can believe you?" asked Rufus. It was Michael who replied, looking right into Pierce's eyes. "I believe him." "What about you?" asked Charlie. "I'll stay if Colborne lets me. Right now, I have nowhere else to go." Ben Walker heard the voice above him shout that he had sighted a sail, but bent over the yard untying a knot, and supported only by his upper arms and a dipping foot-rope, he declined to react. Martin Dent, being more accustomed to being aloft, did, but swore he could see nothing. "Clear away!" called Lieutenant Glaister from the quarterdeck. "Two sail, 5 points free off the starboard bow." The orders came to stop the drill and to set a sail plan more suited to the conditions. Midshipman Fairmelow went past them as they let go of the mainsail, and it was sheeted home by the time he got to the tops with his telescope. Both Martin and Ben Walker were back on deck when he reported what he could see, the shout directed at Ralph Barclay, who had come on deck, happy to leave the mass of paper which littered his desk, and the noisy preparations for yet another dinner being prepared by his wife. "2 ships, sir. One square-rigged, the other with a single mainmast, though the mainsail, lateen-rigged, seems overlarge." "Does it have a colour, that sail?" shouted Barclay through a speaking trumpet, a question that earned him curious looks, but he, having sailed in these waters before, knew why he was asking.
"Deep red, sir."
"The other?"
"Three masts, sir. Dun-coloured sails. I guess it to be some kind of merchant vessel."
"Mr. Glaister, signal to Captain Gould to come alongside. Helmsman, we will be coming round on a course to close."
That led to a string of orders, while in their wake HMS Firefly had cracked on some sail to close.
As she came alongside, Ralph Barclay called out,
"I dare say your lookouts have smoked those sails, Gould. Close until you can identify them, and then let me know what they are. I will be in your wake."
Then it was another shout to the tops.
"Mr. Farmiloe, keep a weather eye out. I want to know if they change course."
"You anticipate that, sir?" asked Glaister as Firefly pulled away.
"Most certainly, as soon as they see we are ships of war."
He pointed to the foremast, where the white pennant streamed out with the national flag in one corner.
"That should tell them they have nothing to fear, but it will be some time before they can see it clearly."
"Unless they are French, sir."
"Take my word for it, Mr. Glaister, that they are not."
His Premier gave a look that encouraged him to disclose his reasons for such certainty, an invitation he declined.
"Ships have altered course, sir, and they've split up."
There was a long pause before Farmiloe yelled again,
"I think the red sail, sir, is a galley of some kind. I can see what appear to be sweeps hitting the water either side, and she's closing with us. The other ship has held its course."
"Sails and oars?" said Glaister, eyebrows raised. Every eye was on Ralph Barclay now, waiting for him to react in some way. All he said was,
"A galley in the name of creation. I never thought to see one of them still in use."
He said no more for an age, until he could see the approaching vessel himself, pleased with his own prescience, for given the colour of the sail he had anticipated the provenance of the sighting, if not the nature of the vessel.
"An old-fashioned Algerine vessel, by the look of it. We will hold our course and see what Captain Gould discovers."
It was half an hour before Gould did anything, and that was to drop a boat in the water. Down below, Emily Barclay was anticipating her dinner, having by now become reconciled to the absurd naval habit of having it at 3 in the afternoon. Unfortunately, due to the sighting, she was having to wait, left to look at the 4 place settings, because today's guests, the Marine officer and 3rd Lieutenant Mitcham, were all on deck with her husband. "Shenton," she said eventually, "be so good as to go and tell Captain Barclay that his dinner is ready." Though he complied, that request got her an old-fashioned look, as though it was not done. But Shenton was like that, the kind to forever shake his head and suck his teeth if asked to do anything out of the ordinary. At least he had got used to her presence, and had learnt to knock before entering any of the cabins. He was back in a few seconds.
"Captain's compliments, Mrs. Barclay, but could he have a plate taken on deck?"
Emily opened her mouth to protest, and to ask what the good captain thought he was going to do about his guests, but that died in her throat. It was unwise to be open with servants about anything that smacked of a family dispute. They might know, indeed they always did, but it was a tenet of respectable life to keep a distance. That stricture was doubly applied on board this ship, where the article of discipline, something she was unsure of, added another dimension. The steward, with his long, doleful face and sad eyes, was looking at her in that way he had, almost as if he had yet to comprehend that she was really aboard. That he was unhappy with the fact was not a secret, much as he tried to cover it, which Emily put down to the increase it created in his responsibilities. Not his workload, for he passed most of that on to others. "Would you go back on deck and ask Captain Barclay if it would be acceptable for his officers to be fed likewise?" It was with plates in hand that the quarterdeck of HMS Brilliant observed Gould's boat, the gap shortening rapidly as the rowers pulled hard to close, and it gave Ralph Barclay cause for disquiet. It was a strange way to behave, and hinted at a message more complicated than that which could be sent by flags.
"Mr. Farmiloe, do you see anything of interest?"
"The galley-type vessel is holding its course, sir, but coming into the wind. She has clewed up her mainsail. The merchant ship has ported her helm and is heading due east."
"Armament?"
"2 heavy cannon bows and stern, sir, by my reckoning, but I cannot see what weight of shot they will take."
"Mr. Glaister, I do not want to clear for action, but I would want some of the preliminaries carried out so that, should we have to, we can get our guns out and into action quickly. Alert the gunner and prepare the lady-hole for my wife."
Glaister, who had just taken a mouthful of beefsteak and oyster sauce, the last of the Lisbon stores, replied with a muffled,
"My mither."
Emily, alone at the table trying to eat the same dish, was rudely interrupted by a posse of sailors, Shenton at their head, not sad-faced now, but actually smirking.
"Sorry, Ma'am, we've got to strike the bulkheads and cabin furniture below, and that means crating the plate and silverware. Captain has sent a party to get some seating and a lantern in the cable tier, just in case we get into a fight."
With that she was hustled out of her quarters, asking in vain for her embroidery, as the wedges were knocked out and the walls of the cabins began to disappear.
"Stand by to get a line to haul in that boat."
Whoever was coxing that knew his stuff, crossing Brilliant's bow to bring himself onto the lee rail, lower in the water than the weather side of the ship, and he spun her expertly so that she was on the same course, only closing to the side when the bowsprit was past. Lines snaked out from the deck to haul her in, at the same time as boat-hooks were employed to keep a slight gap between boat and the side of the ship, by which time Ralph Barclay was leaning over the side.
"Captain Gould has identified her as a galley, sir."
How clever of him, Ralph Barclay thought testily. Does he think we have no eyes aboard Brilliant?
"Reckons her an Algerine pirate, sir, from off the Barbary coast, and that merchantman a capture. Galley has sent her away and is likely to challenge our right to bring her to and demand answers." "Does he think she'll fight?" "Rather than give up the capture, yes, sir."
Ralph Barclay was tempted to say, "Well, at least we agree on something," but he held his tongue, disinclined to share the thought with anyone else on deck.
"Sheer off. We will let fly our sheets and get you aboard."
That order took Glaister by surprise. He thought closing with the galley more important, but Ralph Barclay was not about to explain his reason for not leaving a boatload of sailors in the water when a North African pirate, possibly prepared to be hostile, was in the offing. Having served in the Mediterranean as a youngster, he knew all about them. If it did come to a scrap, he had no notion to leave these men in a position where they might be captured, to end up in a stinking North African dungeon, or as a slave-rower on the kind of vessel he was about to meet. Another order had the cooped livestock in the boat before it was let aft to be towed astern. The hoofed animals, the goat, a cow, 3 pigs, and a couple of sheep, would just have to take their chances in the manger.
"Sheet home!" Glaister called as soon as the tasks were completed and HMS Brilliant resumed her course.
Ralph Barclay went to the weather side of the quarterdeck to pace up and down, head down and hands behind his back. It was a telling fact that a galley was at sea at all, for it must be an old vessel, they not having been in use for near a century for any kind of fighting, though still common in coastal trading and port work. Even North African pirates used xebecs these days, small and fast, if no match for a frigate. But he supposed, with the seas clear of French warships because of the decimation of their navy, and Spaniards who were gathering at Cadiz to re-enter the Mediterranean in force, the way was clear for all sorts of vermin to emerge. If that galley was a corsair, then he had every right to employ whatever force he needed to stop her activities. As against that, there would be no proof. That, if it existed, was sailing away from him as fast as the wind would carry her. This would be the Algerine's ploy, to delay him as long as possible so that he could not chase the other vessel, which could never hope to outrun a frigate, let alone HMS Firefly. He tried to put himself in the mind of the galley commander. He would come alongside Gould with expressions of cordiality and keep him occupied till Brilliant closed. There would no doubt be an invitation to visit and an offer of food, talk of many things, anything to keep the two British warships where they were. If that was successful and he had taken an illegal capture, it would be near his home port long before they could come up with her. Ralph Barclay could not decline an offer of hospitality without causing offence, and his orders obliged him to treat with neutrals carefully, and that included the various bays and days of the North African coast, who could cause no end of trouble to a fleet trying to control the Mediterranean, quite apart from the fact that it was a place to secure supplies to maintain that fleet. The normal tactic was to bribe them to stay out of the way and leave alone supply ships and merchantmen. Not one man in 1,000 believed the Algerines to be neutral in any other sense than that they were not fighting the French. If they came across a British merchantman, bribed or not, they would take her if they thought they could get away with it. Was that fleeing merchantman that very thing, a well-laden Levant trader that had sailed before any convoys were formed, or one on the way home laden with silks and spices? Whatever, it would be worth a mint of money, and Ralph Barclay was minded to secure that rather than leave it to a bunch of sea-born brigands. In his mind he formed a plan, one that might be profitable if he was right, which would keep him out of trouble if he was wrong.
"Mr. Glaister, I want the larboard battery loaded with powder charges only. Tell the gunner to use his worst leavings, the bottom of the barrel stuff, for what I want is smoke. Let us ease our braces a little and signal Captain Gould to come about and close with us, and ask my wife to come on deck."
By the time Firefly was sailing on her previous station, with Gould, like Brilliant's officers, fully appraised of what to do, the deck of the galley was in plain view through a telescope, a clutch of turbaned and gaudily dressed individuals on a raised poop watching him as they were being watched themselves. They would have observed the two warships resume their previous course and speed, sailing easy, braces not stretched, in the manner of vessels concerned to spare their canvas. No great activity on deck, for that had ceased an age ago on the frigate, and had not taken place at all on Gould's ship. To complete the tranquil scene, they would see a captain in full uniform walking the weather rail arm in arm with a pretty young woman. They were not talking, for Ralph Barclay was thinking, and Emily was obliged to respect that. He suspected that the galley's guns, in both prow and stern, would be loaded and bowsed against her gun ports, an act which would have been carried out long before her deck came in view. He had examined the ship closely while she was further off. What was showing of her well-reefed great mainsail, hauled right round, was not doing much to propel her. If anything, it was slowing her progress. Forward motion was being provided by the poor souls pulling on her sweeps below the main deck, slaves of many nationalities, some bound to be Christians. But they were rowing easily, too. There was no attempt to close at speed, for the longer it took, the better. Calculation was continuous as well as futile. He could not tell from looking through a telescope how large was her crew. For instance, did her captain have enough men to put a whole new set of rowers on the sweeps? Whether, indeed, her cannon were loaded, or if the supposition he was making was correct. All he knew was that it made sense. "What a fine-looking ship," said Emily.
"Over-decorated to my taste, my dear, and old-fashioned as a gun platform. For her size, too much space is taken up by rowers, as well as her shape, to mount the kind of cannon she should. And as a fighting vessel, they are utterly useless in foul weather. Algerines are the only people who would still use them in the open sea, and only then when the weather is calm."
The galley, once she was close, let fly the sheets on her scrap of mainsail, and raised her starboard sweeps, gliding round in an arc to come between the British warships and what might be her capture. Again that was indicative of a less than honest motive, and the sweeps were not boated. They stayed out, there to manoeuvre the vessel and her prow in a way that no square-rigged ship could hope to match. Well-trained vessels such as these could turn in their own length, and cock a snook at the wind on an unruffled sea. Ralph Barclay had to be careful everything on his deck was made to look as if he was really going to heave to, speed slowing and the rudder swinging the frigate so it would heave to opposite the north-south facing galley, all the men on deck seemingly engaged in unimportant tasks. The bang made both him and his wife start, but it was just a brass swivel gun saluting his pennant. Only it was, for Ralph Barclay, a different kind of signal, that and the fact that he dare not heave to completely, for it would take too much time to get under way again.
"Go to the cable tier now, Mrs. Barclay."
As Emily obeyed this command, her husband said,
"Mr. Glaister, if you please."
The Premier was no slow West Highlander at that moment. The speaking trumpet came out from behind his back and a stream of orders followed. The wasters ran to the falls and hauled tight those sails already set, while the gun crews were at their weapons, ports opening and cannon run out in a matter of seconds. The helm was down as more sails cascaded from the yard, dropped by topmen who had raced aloft, and with that wind HMS Brilliant began to move more swiftly, with the rudder pushed hard over to take the frigate past the stern of the other vessel.
"Fire!"
There was no aiming. Without cannonballs it was not necessary. What Ralph Barclay was after was sound, fury, and smoke, enough of the first to convince those on the galley's deck that he was firing at them, enough of the second to ensure their gunners kept their heads down for a few seconds, with the third obscuring what was happening on his deck. Trouble was, it obscured the other deck as well, but he could well imagine that the Algerine was spinning round on its sweeps, running out loaded bow cannon to retaliate. Behind him, Gould had come round swiftly on a southerly course to take him past the galley at long pistol-shot range, in the hope of avoiding damage from those same weapons. The breeze whipped the smoke forward off his deck, and he could see the oars in the water biting to bring the galley round and aim its cannon, now poking out through open ports. But he was sailing better now, his bowsprit already beyond the point where the stern had been. And on the opposing deck they would have realized that no shot had come with his own broadside, and that would put doubt in their mind. If they delayed the order to fire for half a minute, he would be damn near clear. The cannon were run in and properly loaded this time, for he knew he might need some round shot, the only nagging thought being that he had no idea how quickly that galley could make way through the water at full tilt. With her great mainsail drawing on a following wind and sweeps to boost her speed, she might have the legs of him. Aloft, Ben Walker, having beaten young Martin up the shrouds for the first time, was very pleased with himself, cackling to the boy that he would have to learn to shift if he was to be an upper yardsman. On the end of the mainmast he was pounding the canvas to loosen and drop it so that it would fully draw. Suddenly the air was alive with round shot, and a hole appeared beneath his feet. But it was a following ball that hit the yard and, smashing through the timber, blew him off, too fast for the hand of Martin to grab and save him. The ship was heeled over, and had he not been propelled sideways by the blast he would have smashed into the deck. As it was, his momentum carried him just past the scantlings and into the deep blue water. Going under, he was vaguely aware of the coppered bottom of his floating home sliding by, but immersed he did not hear Martin's scream of "Man overboard!" Ben Walker could not swim, so by the time he resurfaced, carried up only by his own natural buoyancy, spluttering and blinded by seawater, the ship was nearly past him. The latticed hatch cover, grabbed by a couple of his shipmates at Martin's shout and slung as close to him as possible, actually landed within reach of his arm, and with a couple of panicked kicks, Ben got a hold on it. It was from there that he watched the decorated stern of HMS Brilliant disappear, the last thing to go past his nose, some 10 feet distant and totally unreachable, a boat full of clacking and fearful chickens. Martin, from his elevated position, could see him, and knew at least on that hatch cover Ben could float. But he also knew that Ralph Barclay would not heave to for the sake of one man, for to do so would risk the ship. Instead of going down on deck as he was ordered, the youngster climbed to the masthead, so that he could keep an eye on a man with whom he had wanted to be friends, paying no attention, as everyone else on the ship was doing, to the attempts by the Algerine to put round shot into Firefly, which suffered in the sails as her consort had done. Nor did he pay attention to the galley coming round sharply on those sweeps, huge mainsail set, to begin a pursuit. His only thought was that with 3 ships close by, not one had any care for a solitary sailor in distress, who would surely drown if he did not die of hunger and thirst. It was a quarter of an hour before Ralph Barclay relaxed, sure that he could outrun the galley, and to aid him the sea was getting up on a hot wind coming off the Maghreb shore. Being choppy, it was helping him and hindering his opponent. He listened intently as Glaister reported the damage, the end of the mainmast gone, the odd spar carried away, and 1 man lost overboard. In all, a very satisfactory outcome. And ahead of him was that fleeing merchantman, which he was sure, with he and Gould well spread out to cover a lot of sea, he would catch the next day.
"Are you hungry, Mr. Glaister?"
"A little, sir."
"Damn me, sir, I am more than that. My belly is rumbling. I wonder if you could send someone to ask my wife if there are any leftovers from our missed dinner."
The Algerine gave up the chase long before nightfall, leaving both warships to eat up the sea miles until 4 bells in the night watch, when they hauled their wind and reversed their course. The calculation was that the merchant vessel, hopefully unaware of what had happened in her wake, had been told to hold her own course until a certain hour, then come about to rendezvous at a prearranged point, for they had been sailing due south when first spotted, so it was a fair bet, looking at the charts, that the home port they were aiming for was either Oran or Mostaganem, Algiers itself being too far to the east. Stood to at dawn, they spotted her hull up as the sun rose, and the chase began. Not that the outcome could be in any doubt, and that was removed completely when the merchantman let fly her sheets. Within minutes there was a boat over the side, and a single mast stepped, that followed by a triangular sail. Through his telescope Ralph Barclay watched the men piling into the boat, thought he caught a flash of white, saw them brace their sail tight and set off due south to the shore which lay over the horizon.
"They have abandoned her, sir."
"They have, Mr. Glaister," said Ralph Barclay sadly. "Please ask Mr. Lutyens to be ready to go aboard, and, Mr. Glaister, ensure that while we are alongside my wife does not come on deck."
The merchantman, a large, fully laden levanter as Ralph Barclay had suspected, wallowed on the swell, and they approached in what was an eerie silence. The deck itself was clear, if not clean, and hooked on he went aboard himself, with Lutyens making a pig's ear of crossing the 2 bulwarks, and having to be aided over by 2 sailors. Most of the bodies were below in the crew quarters, their throats cut from ear to ear, and so recently that the cramped space was awash with fresh blood. Clearly they had been kept aboard as prisoners to sail the ship. The master, likewise, was dead in what had once been the luxuriously appointed cabin, and he had endured more, his face bloated with bruising, his breeches round his ankles, for purposes Ralph Barclay had no desire to think about. In the side cabin there was evidence of female occupation, clothing, a mirror, hairbrushes, and the like. That explained the flash of white. It had been a woman forced into that boat. He had a sudden vision of his own young bride, and what that woman, probably the master's wife, must have suffered already. She would suffer more, there was no doubt of that, and the captain of HMS Brilliant, not a deeply religious or caring man, nevertheless said a silent prayer for her. "Not one alive," said Lutyens. "Why?"
"Death means they are not able to bear witness to piracy. There was a woman taken alive."
"Is there a reason why they let her live? Surely she can bear witness, as well as any man."
"Mr. Lutyens, if she is fair and plain-skinned, she will be sold to some harem in the interior, never to be heard of again. If she is not fair, she may well end up scrubbing Mussulmen's floors with a daily beating to make sure she does her work."
"We could not go after them and rescue her?"
"No, for then they would slit her throat too."
Leafing through the manifests, he realized just how valuable a cargo this vessel carried, saffron and vanilla, the first the most precious of spices, but many more all the way down to peppercorns and silks, the whole certainly not less than £100,000 in value. But he could not rejoice, and felt it would be gross to even begin to think about his own share of so rich a prize. Back on deck, he called over to his own ship.
"Mr. Glaister, sort out a party to take charge of the prize under the command of the third lieutenant. He is to take the ship into Gibraltar, and hopefully he can pick up the fleet from there and return to us when they join." "Aye, aye, sir." "And tell Mr. Mitchum he can borrow the sailmaker for an hour or two. As to canvas and balls to weight the victims' shrouds, I'm sure there is enough aboard for the necessary burials."
Griffin was cruising off the north coast of Brittany to cover a route that would be taken by St. Malo privateers looking for quarry, and was by now settled into a tedious routine of ploughing a box on the charts that would, Colborne hoped, intercept them either on the way to their hunting grounds or their prizes coming in, sent back lightly manned to the Corsairs' home port. But as usual, all they had seen for days, apart from one large and intact British incoming convoy, were neutral merchant vessels that were happy to heave to for inspection, and, quite naturally, this did not please the men. It was curious for Pierce to listen to the loud and clear moaning of the crew through the canvas, rather than to be part of it, and even although it was nothing like the pitch it had been with his encouragement, it gave him some idea of how uncomfortable it must have been for Short, Bailey, and the captain. Other discomforts came from lack of knowledge and constantly interrupted sleep, but by reading Bailey's books on seamanship he began to get some idea of how a ship worked, what was meant by a bowline, the number of points free on a compass a ship could sail into the wind, a better understanding of leeway and how it affected a ship's course, and even the currents of the waters in which they were sailing, tidal flows that changed predictably over the lunar cycles throughout every 24-hour period, based on the time at Dover. What was less helpful was the disinclination of either Colborne or Short to add to that educative process, which left him to find out a great deal for himself. But never before he had exposed his ignorance. And daily, indeed hourly, he gnawed on the guilt associated with what had happened in Paris, sometimes finding himself near to a feeling of hate for his father for burdening him with such a responsibility, welcoming any diversion that took his mind off the events of that day. If anything had been said about him to the rest of the crew, it had been done out of his hearing, but the change in attitude was quick. Really, Pierce knew all he needed was O'Hagan on his side, for although the crew did not go in fear of him, he was no bully, they did respect his prowess with his fists, so were not inclined to dispute with him. Besides that, Michael was quite naturally a bit of a bellwether for others. People trusted Michael O'Hagan, or disliked him, and there were few of the latter. Charlie, for a while, tried to remain distant, as if to imply he was considering before making up his mind, with Rufus, as befitted his nature, dithering one way then the other. But within 2 days they had fallen into line, not yet chatty and friendly, but not glaring and suspicious. The rest of the crew began to josh him in a gently disparaging way, which Pierce knew was not ill-intentioned, merely by the tone. Apart from his every instruction being carried out in a normal way, the most pleasing thing was the isolation of Gerson. Clearly, feeling deserted, Michael had not let the crew know of the theft of his letter. Just as obviously, with their friendship re-established, he had done so now, and the sod was on the receiving end of kicks, shoves, and much spitting, for there was nothing worse to a sailor than an on-board thief. The irony being that Pierce, if he saw any of this, had to intervene to protect him. The reaction of Colborne was surprise, which led to a command once more, right after the crew's breakfast, to attend upon him in his cabin. "You are a slippery fellow, are you not?" Pierce declined to answer. He just met the lieutenant's eye. "And full of yourself to boot. You dare to try and stare me down, which is insubordinate." "It would be of some help, sir, if you could write down what is and what is not an offence, so that I may learn. I cannot feel that to decline to reply to what seems like an accusation can be seen as that."
The solution for me, Pierce, is to have aboard inferiors who know their place.
The ability to command the men. Colborne interrupted him then, but he was no longer looking at Pierce. He was looking at his desk, his shoulders set in a crabbed, stubborn way, almost as if he was talking to himself.
I should have handed you over to the magistrates as soon as I found out who you were. I'm too soft.
And now, sir, you are too late. It was the wrong thing to say, which Pierce knew as soon as it left his lips, for Colborne slapped the desk.
Do not talk to me, man, as though you are my equal. You are aboard on my sufferance, in the lowest station a man can hold, and still call himself a gentleman.
You wish to withdraw that status?
No!
Colborne did not say so, but it was obvious to both that to return him to his previous rating would be worse than suffering him in his present one. Quite literally, leaving him be was the lesser of two evils. Pierce was silent too, though there was a lot that he would have liked to have brought out into the open, not least an open admission of Colborne's plan to pay him back in kind. That had backfired, leaving nothing but the spite with which it had been initiated. But he did remind himself of that to which the lieutenant had just alluded. He could have turned him in after he had read Lutchen's letter, but had not done so. Whatever his behaviour since, Pierce owed him for that. There was another reason for holding his tongue. He did not want to lose this little bit of rank. In only a few days, even with all the vicissitudes he had faced, he had taken to life aboard much more than he had as a lowly landsman. If his berth was cramped, there was some solitude. The food was no better, but it was eaten out of sight of anyone but Short, and often even he was not present. He had books to read, not those he would have chosen necessarily, but there was no chance for such a thing in the space he had occupied before. It was, all in all, if far from perfect, a much better existence. Added to that was his promise to the other pelicans. His blue coat meant he could be much more active in helping them to run. Colborne sat back suddenly, his face showing no sign of his previous anger. If anything, he looked bemused.
Tell me, Pierce, what future do you see for yourself?
Was it an olive branch? Pierce could not be sure, but it was such a startling change of tack, both in manner and expression, that he was inclined to take it so. He made every effort to keep out of his reply any hint of arrogance. If it was what he suspected, the best thing to do was to meet it halfway. I would be less than honest, sir, if I said I knew.
The Navy?
Possibly.
Then let me enlighten you to some unpleasant facts. You have this berth because of an injury to Mr. Bailey, which I will rescind on his return to duty. Will he return to duty? He is not obliged to, being a volunteer, and I have no notion that he took to the life. Quite apart from that, even one so young will have realized that this is no place to be for anyone interested in advancement, so he may seek another ship and another captain.
Pierce was thinking, 6 weeks, 2 voyages, not much time to help his pelicans desert.
Maybe I will keep you aboard, but such a thing could be as much a curse as a blessing, for you cannot get anywhere in the Navy without influence. Do you have influence, Pierce? I am on this vessel instead of a frigate or a ship of the line because I lack a patron, a senior captain, an admiral or someone with either blue blood or political power to move me up in the service.
Yet you are a lieutenant, are you not?
I had the good fortune to be in the West Indies when I was promoted. That is a station where such things are made to fill dead men's shoes. I have no inclination to believe that my elevation would have happened anywhere else. How can I complain? My pleas to the Admiralty for employment did not go entirely unheard.
A bitter tone crept into his voice, and his eyes ranged round his tiny space.
Though sometimes when I look at what I have, I wonder whether someone has sent me to this as a cruel jest. Every time we touch the shore, I send off a plea to be moved to another ship. I point out that, ideally, given the length of my service, I should be a first lieutenant on a 74. And each time we touch again, I have my reply.
The bitter sarcasm larded Colborne's voice as he revealed what the replies said, staring at the deck beams above his head as he spoke.
The Commissioners for executing the office of Lord High Admiral have taken cognizance of your request, but fear, given the level of similar requests they are forced to satisfy, they are in no position to oblige. You are, of course, at liberty to resign your present commission at any time of your own choosing, in the expectation that some other employment may become vacant.
You are saying that I should not look to the Navy for a future? Pierce never got a reply, for the curtain was thrown back and Colborne's steward appeared.
Mr. Short's compliments, sir, but the lookout has espied a ship to the south-east, and he begs to give the opinion it ain't no merchant vessel.
Given the lack of space, Pierce had to go out of the cabin before him, but stood aside to let Colborne pass on the way up to the deck. The lieutenant immediately took a telescope from the rack and followed Short's finger, trained it on what had been seen. Not difficult, as ploughing into the wind on the southerly side of their box the yards were braced right round. Pierce stood with the southwest wind on his face, just observing.
"All hands," he said as soon as he had focused, his voice strained. "Stand by to come about."
"Might I ask—" Short never got a chance to finish his question as Colborne barked at him.
"It is an enemy 74, Mr. Short, and he has the weather gauge. So if you do not desire to spend the rest of your days in a French prison, I should get on with obeying my orders." "Sail has altered course, sir," the lookout called down. "Mr. Short, I want that man in chains," Colborne hissed. "Those sails should have been spotted an age ago. Get a better pair of eyes aloft this minute."
The little midshipman's old, lined face looked aggrieved, as if Colborne were chastising him and not the man at the masthead.
"I did my best, sir."
That was when Colborne blew. His voice was heard all over the ship.
"Then your best, sir, is not good enough, and I doubt you know this, but we stand little chance in this vessel of outrunning a ship at the line."
Then the voice softened, as though he was talking to himself.
"Let us hope she is a dog, or a bottom covered in weed."
The orders were issued, and the ship came up into the wind with little grace, HMS Griffin behaving as she always did, and Colborne put her right before the wind, jagging to starboard and larboard slightly to get the best out of her, and setting as much aloft as she would bear. Pierce was fascinated by the air of the man, an aura of total competence as he stood rooted to the spot, doing nothing but issue one order after another. Now he was training his telescope over the stern, fixed on those high sails, which he knew had altered course on spying the sails of the smaller vessel, first to close, now to pursue.
"Mr. Pierce, get the hatches off on the lower deck and men standing by with axes to start the water. Then we will need a party on the pumps, with the relief standing by."
That party should have included the Pelicans, but Charlie Taverner looked at John Pierce in a jaundiced way that implied he was likely to be unfair, even if that was not the case. They were lubbers, and it made no sense to put a trained seaman to a job that required no brains or ability, and some brawn. Thinking himself too soft, he gave his mates the axes, and he detailed Little John to lead them, that as Colborne issued another order.
"Set up the fire engine as well and get the hose down to the bilges. It will speed things up. And, Mr. Pierce, remind anyone slacking of what fate awaits them."
He wanted to ask questions, not one but several, but it was clear to Pierce that Colborne would be in no mood to answer. How had he identified the other ship so swiftly? For he could only have seen her sails. If they could overhaul Griffin, how long did they have? From his reading he had a good idea that they were being swept along by a helpful current. But a picture of the map in his head told him that, and the course they were on was taking them in the direction of Guernsey, the outermost of the Channel Islands, which Bailey's book on sailing in these waters had said was a place of powerful tides requiring extreme caution and good seamanship. After a long flurry of activity, everything went quiet. The ship was set on its course. All that Colborne required to be done was in place, the crew now free to look themselves over the stern at the enemy 74, though all they could see was the odd tip of a brownish sail topping the horizon and the slight flash of a pennant. Looking at Colborne, still with his eye to the telescope most of the time,
Pierce wondered at his thoughts, even more so when he dropped the glass from his eye to reveal a face full of perplexed calculation.
"Mr. Pierce, start the water and get the pumps and fire engine going. Mr. Short, I want a crane rigged over the hatches to get out our stores. I'm going below to study the charts."
"Bugger's gaining on us," said Latimer. "That's for certain."
Pierce heard these words as he followed Colborne down the companionway ladder, a group of men behind him with axes in their hands, 2 others with the fire engine hose, the rest left behind to man the pumps, which had been rigged on each side of the deck. The next drop was down into the forward hold, damp, smelly, and dark. He was not sure he heard scurrying. It might have been his imagination, but he knew there were rats down there.
"Lanterns," he ordered, "and get that deck hatch lifted to give us some air."
"What's Colbarge looking at the charts for?" asked Rufus.
"If I knew the answer to that, I'd be in charge, not Colborne."
"He'll be looking for a landfall, mate," said Littlejohn. "Some place to run the ship ashore and burn her."
"Christ!" exclaimed Charlie.
"Anything to avoid being taken."
"What do we do, then?"
"Those that's allowed into the boats can make for home once the coast is clear."
"And who might they be?"
"Dry mans like me, mate."
"And the rest?" Little John clearly enjoyed his next answer. He was almost laughing.
"Lubbers like you, Charlie, walk to the nearest town and hand themselves in."
"Still want to get to France, John boy?" asked Michael. Pierce suspected he was grinning too, but he could not see him in the dark, though he reasoned that if what Little John was saying was true, then he would at least be in a position to help those who would be left behind. It was not a prospect that excited him, just a duty that he knew he would have to perform. Light first came with the removal of the deck hatch cover, faint, grey, and insufficient. The lanterns followed, and Pierce surveyed the stacked barrels resting one on top of the other and thanked the Lord they were on an even swell, for such things were dangerous in anything else when there was flesh and bone about.
"What's the best way to do this?" he asked.
Again it was Little John who responded. "Stove in the tops of them you can get at. Then once they's emptied, they're easy to shift."
"We'll run out of room in no time. Charlie, get aloft and ask the carpenter's mates to come below and knock off the hoops. We can throw the staves up through the hatchway."
As Taverner obliged, Pierce took an axe out of Rufus's hand and went for a barrel. Sharp as it was, he was not well balanced, and there was no room for a full swing, so the damned thing, hitting what was a thin piece of wood, bounced back at him, the blade narrowly missing his shins. The laugh came from Michael as well as the words.
"Happen you need a real worker for that task, John boy. Step aside."
Even in the gloomy light, Pierce could see that the axe in Michael's hand looked like a toy, and when the Irishman swung it there was no bounce. It went straight through, and as Michael extracted it, a stream of water gushed out. Another smack, this time followed by a twist, removed the lid whole, so that the barrel emptied in seconds and was pushed to one side so that they could get at the next. Above their head they could hear muffled shouting, then the sound of running feet, but they had no idea what it portended until Colborne's voice called down the hatch,
"Mr. Pierce, belay that and get the men on deck."
"Sir," he replied before ordering the men out, and the lanterns doused. He was the last out of the hold, last to get on deck, last to find out why everyone was grinning, to receive the news that there was relief in the offing, that a British warship had been sighted north of their position, one which had yet to be seen from the deck.
"Let that be a lesson to you, Mr. Short," Colborne said in a voice that was almost happy. "Only put aloft as a lookout men who have good eyes and the brains to look in all directions. Now, hold our course and prepare the signal, 'Enemy in sight,' and have the gunner load a signal gun."
Colborne made his way to the shrouds and, tucking in his telescope, began to climb, which impressed Pierce. Yet it made sense. If you were in command and you wanted to see for yourself, there was no other way. Besides, being at the masthead would add a good deal of time to that which you had to form any plan of action. He was almost tempted to follow out of sheer curiosity.
Colborne was up there for a good 20 minutes, sweeping his glass first forward, then over the stern to the still-chasing Frenchman, who would be too far off to see the other sail to the north. It was like an itch Pierce could not scratch, wondering what was going through the man's mind. He longed to be up there, making decisions, not following those of someone else, however much that person knew more than he.
"Will you be after stopping all that hopping about, Mr. Pierce?" said Michael. He was Mr. on deck, and John Boy when they were out of officer earshot. "Sure you'll be wearing a hole in the deck and sinking us." That got a laugh from all who heard it, as the man it was aimed at realized that was what he had just been doing.
"Mr. Short, send aloft the signal."
The flags flew up the halyard and fluttered in the breeze, and the gunner, who had been alerted to do so, fired the signal gun, which, if it could not be heard, would attract the eye because of the smoke.
"Helmsman, ease off a few points so the signal can be read."
The ship slowed perceptibly as it came off its best point of sailing.
"Stand by to come about, Mr. Short, and close with the enemy. Once we are on our new course, you can clear for action."
There was a palpable air of excitement about the crew as they obeyed that last order, and the armed cutter came about with something approaching stateliness. It was that same driver Pierce had seen before. Sailors, it seemed, were happy as long as something, anything, was happening. It was boredom that rendered them cross-grained. Given the traded jocularity, it seemed that the men were quite happy to take on a French 74 without assistance, if that be the case. It was, of course, nothing but bravado. Colborne, back on deck, somewhat spoiled that mood by the way he set a modest sail plan, so that Griffin, once more heading into the wind, made little progress. Clearing a ship like his to fight did not take much. Canvas screens and hammocks came down easy, and the amount of impediments to be struck below were few. It was more the casting off and preparation of the guns, that accompanied by the swivel gun firing at intervals to ensure that the approaching British warship was aware that there was an enemy in the offing. Once completed, and after an interval of 10 minutes when nothing happened, Pierce left his station by the larboard cannon and walked back the half-dozen paces to the quarter-deck, to be greeted by a less than welcoming look from Colborne. The lieutenant turned away as if confused, raising his telescope to stare over the stern.
"Your station is on the guns, Mr. Pierce."
It took a look back along the deck for Pierce to realize that he had broken some taboo. Midshipman Short was standing rigidly behind his cannon, staring out to sea, and the crews, with the exception of the gun captains kneeling by each piece, and the other sailors were gathering groups by the falls ready to work on the sails. No doubt he, likewise, should have stayed at his station, but having failed to do so, he had no choice but to ask that which had brought him here. "Forgive me, sir, but I am curious as to what you have in mind."
"Are you, by damn?"
"I don't think I am alone in that, sir." The telescope came down abruptly, and the hissed reply was soft enough to keep the next exchange just between them.
"You are not suggesting that I discuss what I anticipate, or what I hope, with the whole crew?"
"What harm could it do, sir?"
"You have so much to learn about command, Pierce. Officers make decisions. Their inferiors do as they are bid. You, no doubt, would be the type for a rousing speech."
The signal gun banged out again, and a rather testy Colborne ordered that to cease.
"Our consort has acknowledged. Get that signal down and raise our number so he knows who we are."
Pierce half turned and looked over the bows to the now clearly visible Frenchman, hull up on the swell and with a full suit of sails aloft. "It seems the enemy is still closing, sir."
"He is."
"So he cannot see that he faces 2 British ships, not 1.
"No, Pierce, and I suspect he thinks we are bluffing, using that signal aloft to humbug him, saying that there is another warship in sight because we cannot outrun him."
"What will he do when he is disabused of that?"
"Am I being interrogated?"
Pierce wondered why he was being so tense and uncommunicative. "No, sir. You are being asked what is likely to happen by someone who has no idea."
"It is not necessary for you to have ideas. Just do your duty, Pierce. That will be sufficient. Now go back to your station, and take cognizance of Mr. Short, who has enough of the officer in him not to have left his."
There was no choice but to obey, and as he complied, the lookout called down,
"Frenchman shortening sail, sir."
Colborne was tense, and really talking to himself when he said,
"Now we shall see how the day will progress."
The French 74 may have shortened sail to slow his approach, but he had not altered course, and it took some time to find out why. As usual, members of the crew could recognize their rescuer as soon as enough of her features became visible from the deck.
"Centurion, 50,
said Blubber, who now stood by one of the 9-pounders and had raised himself on the carriage for a better view.
"Does that mean she has 50 guns?"
asked Rufus from the nearby carronade, which got him a withering look that gave an affirmative answer.
"But that Frenchie has got more."
"Need twice the number to take us on,"
called a cheerful voice from across the deck.
"Belay that,"
snapped Short, standing near to 5 foot erect. Latimer, who was one of the 2 larboard quarter-gunners, shook his head at that same remark in a way that told Pierce he did not agree.
"She's no spring chicken age, Miss Centurion. Led down this 30 year or more."
"Which means?" asked Pierce very quietly, hoping that neither Colborne nor Short would hear, for if asking his commanding officer questions in a situation like this was anathema, then it must be that in spades with a member of the crew. Latimer gave him an old-fashioned look that made the same point. Blue coats did not ask advice from common seamen, which on that lined, dark-skinned face looked really crabbed. The look reminded Pierce that he had been a lot less chatty since he had come back aboard, so he added, "I asked the captain, but he seems to want to keep everything to himself."
"Colborne don't know what's going to happen. He ain't keeping out to himself. It'll be the captain of Centurion that makes the choices."
"What do you think he will do?"
"Why are you asking me?"
"Because," Pierce hissed in frustration, "I don't know." Latimer thought for a bit, then relented.
"Was a time that a 50 could stand in the line. Not any more."
"So?" The older man nodded towards the bows.
"So our friend John Crapo yonder will know soon enough what he's facing, if he don't know already. Know that he has the weight of shock to take old Centurion apart, while they're having old and worn timbers. But is he worked up proper? Has he got a crew aboard who knows what they're about? He took a bit of way off, so as he could work out what to do. If he comes on, it'll be because he wants a fight."
"And Centurion?"
"Would be well advised to haul right round to run with us on her tail."
"That's what you would do."
"Damned right. I have no mind to see the scuppers running with blood. That Frenchie has the wind and we don't, so providing he has the lads to man the sails proper, he can do what he likes."
"You've been in battle before?" Those brown eyes fixed Pierce.
"I have, and it ain't the lark some of the buggers on this deck think it is."
"How long have you been at sea, Lance?"
"Can't recall a time I weren't," the old man replied.
Then he grinned and spoke a bit louder.
"According to Michael there, your old pa would have had me an admiral, it's been so long."
"Sure he would that, Latimer, and a right flogging old bugger you'd be."
"Signal from Centurion, sir." So, thought Pierce, people like Latimer knew of his past now. Did they know what had happened since? He suppressed the familiar and troubling images that surfaced then, making himself concentrate on Colborne. Had he made HMS Centurion out, and knew her size and name before he had come back on deck? Maybe he shared Latimer's view. Maybe that was why he had been so tense and terse. He looked aft to where the lieutenant had taken out the signal book and was leafing through it himself, raising his telescope from time to check on a flag. Every eye on his own deck was on him, though they would wait in vain for him to speak. Once he had read the signal, he turned stone-faced to look forward.
"Mr. Short, Mr. Pierce, please join me on the quarter-deck."
When they did so, in the space of a second, he spoke softly, tension very evident in his voice.
"The signal was to engage the enemy more closely, gentlemen."
"Is it the course you would have chosen, sir?" asked Pierce, which earned him a shocked look from Midshipman Short. The look on Colborne's face was totally at odds with his reply.
"I can think of no other."
Then he shook slightly, as if to rid himself of his torpor.
"We will act independently. Centurion will, I think, engage the enemy yardarm to yardarm, though that has yet to be proved. Whatever, we must try to get across her stern and use our carronades to sweep her lower deck. That may, if we are successful, give Centurion some hope."
"Meaning she has little hope now?"
"Are you shy of this?" spat Short.
"I don't know," Pierce replied, just as vexed. "But no doubt with your vast experience of fighting at sea you will be able to tell me if I should be."
"Enough! We will do our duty and support our consort, and with luck we will triumph. Now you may wish to pen a last letter or write a last testament. Once you have done that, go back to your stations and make sure, doubly check, that all is as it should be, for I do not anticipate that we will get more than one chance to affect the outcome of the forthcoming fight."
With no one to write to, Pierce just went back to his station, to be greeted by a whisper from Latimer.
"So, what's happening?"
"We're going to take our Frenchie on. Colborne is going to try and get across her stern and use the carronades."
"The bugger!"
was not suppressed. That followed by Latimer saying to those nearby,
"Time to pray, lads. Whoever's got Centurion is a glory-hunting sod."
Time went slowly as the closing warships, the Frenchmen coming down to topsails for the forthcoming fight, both the British ships forced to keep a full suit aloft, to tack and wear as they closed into the wind. All this Pierce learnt from the men on his part of the deck, who, with the exception of Latimer, seemed indifferent to the possible fate that awaited them. Pierce doubted they were as sanguine as they appeared. No doubt it was that male attitude of not showing fear in front of your fellows, combined with no real idea of what was coming. He himself was quietly grateful for his own ignorance. Since he had little idea of what was about to happen, he could not be in terror of it, and if it presaged death, then he was in no position to avoid it. You cannot run from a ship at sea, and being little different from those he led, nothing would allow him to show that he cared. He thought back to his earlier attempt to extract an explanation from Colborne. He knew nothing about commanding men, but he did know he would have handled matters differently, not least by keeping the crew of Griffin informed of what he was thinking and of what was happening, instead of leaving them to guess. Perhaps Colborne feared that they would fail to do their duty. Did he wonder that he might, for there was none of that fire that had been present on the previous cruise when they had taken that privateer? It was that thought which brought home to Pierce just what they might be sailing into. For a man so wedded to the need for promotion, a successful sea fight would be just the ticket he needed. So for him to be so subdued meant he thought that what they were about was folly, thought that he would be lucky to survive, reckoned that whoever commanded Centurion was crazy to take on a larger and more powerful ship with only an armed cutter to assist. That made Pierce angry, for if Colborne thought that, then he should decline to take part. If there was about to be carnage on this deck, it would not be confined to him. Too afraid to be seen to be cowardly, he was doing the one thing that damned him in John Pierce's eyes. He was failing to stand up to authority. He turned to tell him, to say what true bravery consisted of, when the booming sound of a cannon reverberated across the water, that followed by two huge spouts of water just off the bows.
"No fool, our Frenchie," said Latimer. "He has a mind to take care of us before we can even get close."
"Hearken to that, lads," called Michael O'Hagan. "Admiral Latimer has spoken."
"Is it going to be bad, Pierce?" asked Rufus. Pierce moved to put his hand on the youngster's shoulder, wondering why he was bothering with words of encouragement, wondering if the words he used were addressed to himself rather than Rufus and Charlie. "All we can do here is our best. There's nowhere to go, so not doing that will likely make it more dangerous."
"And pray,"
added Michael, crossing himself as another two spouts of water shot up from the sea, this time close enough for the spray to drift across the deck.
"Happen it's going to get warm," Blubber responded, "so getting a good clench on your arse cheeks will help."
Blonde Sam hooted from down the deck.
"Need a rope and a windlass to close up yours, blubber." "Mr. Short," called Colborne, "below and break out a cask of rum, a large tot to each man at their station. No time to mix it, serve it neat."
"Bugger's human after all," said Charlie Taverner, who looked as pale as a ghost.
"We've been here before, my friends," Pierce said, reminding them of what had happened as members of Ralph Barclay's crew, "and I know we acquitted ourselves well."
"You're right," hooted Michael. "That there French sod might think he has the measure of us, but he has yet to face the Pelicans."
Blubber replied with a huge grin.
"Only thing you got in common with a pelican, Paddy, is the size of your mouth. Sure, it's scarce big enough to swallow you, you overlarded sod."
"Take a whale for that," called Matt. One of the next balls from the Frenchman's bow chasers landed so close to the hull that the ship actually shuddered. Colborne called for the men set to work the sails to stand by, and told the helmsman to bring Griffin onto a more westerly course. For once, having a large crew was an advantage. He had enough men for both sail and gunnery duty. The wisdom of his choice was proved as both the next cannonballs landed over to larboard, but worryingly they seemed to be level with the ship, which meant they had the range.
"Let fly the sheets,"
called Colborne, and that obeyed, the way came off the ship. Waiting a minute, he ordered them sheeted home again, then braced round to sail on a different tack. He was being shrewd, changing course and speed to confound the enemy, waiting for the larger ship to come up and split the onslaught from those bow chasers. HMS Centurion was close now. They could see the men on her deck, though only those close to the bulwarks, given her greater height. But most on the Griffin's deck were more interested in the rum cask and the ladle Short was using to distribute the contents. Neat, with no lime juice to thin it, the rum made even the hardiest tar gag a bit. But there was no doubt it was welcome, a bit of fire in the belly for the coming fight. The next boom did not now come from the Frenchman, but from Centurion, its bow chasers speaking out to tell the enemy that they were coming into range, and that their fire was now to be returned. If the captain had hoped that would spare the Griffin, he was immediately disabused, as another pair of balls arced through the clear air, one of which removed the top of the mainmast, and the lookout who was still up there.
"Topmen aloft!"
Colborne shouted, adding as they raced up the shrouds,
"Secure anything loose and report the damage."
Then he rushed to the side, searching for the man who had been blown overboard in the vain hope that he might have survived.
"Mr. Pierce, an axe at the double and cut the line holding the ship's boats. If the lookout can get to them, he will have a chance."
Pierce was moving before the sentence was finished, and did as he was bid, though he could see no sign of the lookout in the water.
"Resume your place, Mr. Pierce. God will decide whether he survives or not. We cannot heave to and search for one man." "Griffin!"
The voice boomed over the intervening water between the two British vessels.
"Your name, sir?" "Lieutenant Colborne." "Captain Marchand at your service. Let fly your sheets and take station in our wake once we are by, or I fear you will be sunk." "Aye, aye, sir."
The order was obeyed with as much alacrity as Colborne could muster, with that damage aloft. Once in the larger vessel's wake, following it as it tacked and wore, they became blind to what was happening over the bows, except for the sight of what shot missed, landing in the water to either side. That was until one ball from the Frenchman overshot, and having left a neat hole in the mainsail, landed in the white water of Centurion's wake just a few feet from the bowsprit, which brought all work aloft to a halt, as the topman worked to secure flapping lines and the blocks necessary to get what was left of the topmast out and a jury one set up. Then the Centurion's captain was over his taffrail, as below him men worked to block off the casement windows of the various rear cabins, issuing orders through his speaking trumpet.
"Mr. Colborne, I intend to try to get across the stern of the enemy and give him a drubbing, my aim to disable as many of his cannon and gun crews as possible. If I can get past him, I will have the weather gauge. He, I suspect, will continue to fire into my rigging, hoping to disable me and board. I want you, once we are close, to come out of my wake and make as much of a nuisance of yourself as you can, but do not linger in the arc of his larger guns, for I doubt you would survive it. My advice, then, is to take station on his bow and play upon his rigging." "I will do my best, sir." "Of course you will, Mr. Colborne, and your crew, I'm sure. And should we be successful, I think we might look forward to the gratitude of the nation. Why, I would be damned surprised if you were not made post."
"Coffin, more like," spat Latimer.
Pierce could see that the man speaking had just said the right thing to Colborne. It was almost as if his whole shape changed, shoulders going back and head lifting as if to sniff a bright future. But his new midshipman's concerns were different. If it was going to be bloody, was there anything he could do to survive himself and help those under his charge to do the same?
"Well, it won't do you no good standing there like a statue," said Latimer. "Keep moving up and down, because if there's muskets, it'll be you they'll take aim on. If you think they're loading grape, lie down. Being brave will fill you full of holes."
"Anything else?"
"Play."
This was no time to say what he thought of that idea, but he did ask for what?
"That our Frenchie is short-handed, that his crew ain't worked up right and are not handy on the guns, and that their captain is as thick as the bits holding his anchor cable, and that Marchand, or whatever his name is on Centurion, gets in a full broadside afore he's shot to pieces."
Looking past Latimer, he saw his Irish friend, eyes closed and mouth moving silently. "I think Michael is doing enough for all of us."
"I doubt it, because there isn't likely to be enough praise in the world."
The air was suddenly full of booms, so much that Pierce was sure he could feel the pressure of them in the air. Then the waters around Centurion boiled, but not all the shot had missed, and as well as several holes appearing, they heard the sound of cracking timber, that followed by screams. The captain had been replaced at the taffrail by a midshipman, there to relay his orders, so that it was the voice of a near child that informed Colborne that it was time for him to alter course, this as the huge rudder on the ship ahead began to swing. The French 74 soon came into view, having luffed up and fired her broadside at Centurion, and was now busy getting under way again to head-reach her and give her a second broadside at close quarters, square on to her bows. Whatever damage the 50-gun ship had suffered did nothing to hamper her sailing qualities, for as soon as the Frenchman was under way, Marchand spun his ship to first run alongside the Frenchman, and then with luck to get across his stern. The boy on the taffrail relayed the order for Griffin to hold her course and carry out the previous instructions that had been given by the captain. Now they were in full view of the enemy just as he fired a second broadside, this answered by Centurion. There was no doubt about the pressure now. Pierce could feel the air movement in his ears as Colborne ordered Short to fire his cannon, that followed by an order to the quartermaster to note the time on the slate. So the guns of HMS Griffin spoke out, and battle was joined. Close to, from their lower deck, the enemy was a frightening sight. 2 long rows of open gun ports, empty, but shrouded with the leftover smoke from their broadside, the great masts and topsails high above their heads, with men in the tops aiming muskets, even a swivel gun on the mainmast cap. The shot from Griffin did little damage, the balls from 9-pounders skidding off the Frenchman's upper scantlings because they had not been aimed high enough to reach the bulwarks. The 18-pounder carronade balls did strike home, but at the range they were fired, though they did some damage, they did not penetrate the thick planking, and all the while they got closer and closer. Busy reloading, the gun crews failed to see those empty ports fill one by one, dark muzzles poking out until each contained a cannon. With a clarity that surprised him, Pierce could see they were aimed high, the side of the ship suddenly shrouded in thick black smoke belching out behind the fired shot. Through that smoke came Centurion's reply, her cannonballs smashing into the enemy at main-deck level, the clang as metal struck metal reverberating across the water in between. As the wind blew the smoke clear, he could see that 2 of those French gun ports had been blown asunder. They were closer now, and with better aim Griffin's guns did some damage on the second broadside, though mostly just to the top timber near the bowsprit, decorative stuff rather than anything vital. The next broadside came from Centurion, quicker to reload than her opponent, but that was only seconds, and since the 2 capital ships had closed the gap between them, it seemed that the intervening space was nothing but a maelstrom of death and destruction. So much smoke billowed across the face of the French cannon that those aboard Griffin did not see that on reappearing the forward guns were aimed not at Centurion, but at themselves. They found out to their cost within seconds, as the deck and the lower tops were swept with grape-shot. Pierce felt the small balls whistle past his head, so close he wondered how he survived, and he heard the screams from behind of those that took them. With his gun crews reloading, most in crouched positions because of that, it was the men waiting by the starboard guns that bore the brunt, and turning he saw half a dozen writhing in agony, while 2 or 3 more appeared to be already dead. Midshipman Short, who had stood rigid as he thought it his duty to do, was lying in the middle of the deck, a pool of blood spreading from his body, one hand clutching at the air as if a grip would give him a hold on life. But it was by the wheel that the worst damage had been done. Colborne was on his knees holding a shattered and badly bleeding arm, head bowed, while the quartermaster and one of his mates were sprawled against the side, clearly in deep agony. It was instinct that took over then, and he called to those on the starboard battery who had survived. 3 of you, get onto the wheel and hold our course. The rest get the wounded below, and any not occupied to this side and get your heads down. Cannon reloaded, shouted Latimer, that repeated by the forward quarter-gunner. Pierce shouted his reply without looking round. Fire as soon as you can. I never heard that one afore, the old seaman replied, as he ordered the gun captains to pull their lanyards. Not paying attention, trying to order the decks cleared of the wounded, Pierce had got too close to the recoiling guns, and it was one of the gun captains jumping clear that knocked him clean over onto the deck just as the next set of shot from the Frenchman swept across the deck. This time it was round shot, and aimed into the rigging, and lying on his back looking up he saw ropes cut through, with blocks blown asunder and a mast knocked out of its chains, so that he had to cover his head as the debris rained down on the deck. Yet he was aware and deeply impressed by the fact that much was going on regardless, powder monkeys still moving towards the guns with their cartridges while they were being swabbed and reloaded, men looking to their fallen comrades without instructions, others going aloft unbidden to see to the damaged rigging. Rolling to his feet, he got to Midshipman Short, taking that still groping hand and using it to turn him slightly so he could see the wound. Eyes closed and in deep pain, the little man looked 90. The shoulder was shattered, and blood was pumping out of open veins. He called to 2 seamen, and grabbing a 9-pounder wad, pressed it against the wound. Don't take him below. Get him against a bulwark and keep that wad in place. Press hard on it to try and stop the flow of blood. Latimer was beside him suddenly. You'd best get on that quarterdeck, because there ain't no other to take charge. Coal barge is still down. Guns are being taken care of. Pierce got to the wounded lieutenant in 3 big strides and, kneeling, lifted his head. Mr. Colborne! Get me to my feet, Pierce. We must look to the wound. The reply was bitter and came through clenched teeth. Damn it, man! Do you ever obey an order? Being on the side of the wounded arm, Pierce had to cross to Colborne's good arm, with just enough time to glance and see that the way on the ship had taken the Griffin clear of the Frenchman's bows. Not that they were safe, for the 2 bow chasers they had faced earlier were waiting for them, muzzles pointing down right at the stern. Pierce could never understand then or afterwards, as they both fired, why he threw himself to cover the lieutenant's back. He just did it out of instinct. It was not metal in the air now. It was wood blasted from the stern rail and the deck below it. Pierce's hat went, speared by a sliver of timber, and he felt a searing pain across his scalp. Another splinter from the taffrail, pointed like a dagger, embedded itself in the planking right by his hand, shuddering like a thrown knife. Again there were screams of pain from those who had been less fortunate, not least those men he had put on the wheel, which, like them, was smashed, so that the ship was now drifting. With some effort he got Colborne to his feet, and watched as the man, holding his shattered arm with his good hand, pulled himself upright, his voice strained by pain as he spoke, and hard to hear over the continuing gunfire that consumed the 2 larger vessels. "Report the damage, Mr. Pierce." "I wouldn't know where to begin,"
The head came up with a defiant look in the eye, which also managed to convey the fact that he was useless.
"Send the carpenter into the hold to see if we are taking in water. Make sure that any wounded on the gun crews are replaced. We must get men aloft to secure what needs it, and to run lines so that we can reset our sails and come about to re-engage."
Most of that, short of checking for leaks, was happening without his bidding. The men on the ship knew what to do without orders, but the idea of re-entering the fray after the damage Griffin had suffered seemed mad. "The wheel is shattered."
"The rudder?"
Pierce looked round, observing that the stern post looked to be undamaged, and he said so.
"Then we can still, thank God, steer. And as long as we can do that, we can fight. Get a party below to my cabin and work the rudder from the ropes. You'll need a relay of messengers."
Colborne tried to turn round, but a stab of deep pain stopped him, and his head bowed again, the cracked voice evidence of how much he was suffering.
"How does Centurion fare?"
A glance was enough. She seemed to be drifting. The rigging was a mess, broken masts, tattered canvas, ropes hanging loose. The bulwarks, too, were full of gaps, and it was a fair bet that some of the main-deck guns had been dismounted. What it was like below, he shuddered to think. "Badly."
"Has Captain Marchand got across her stern?"
"No."
"And the enemy?"
The Frenchman had swung side-on to Griffin, and for a moment Pierce had a vision of a full broadside coming their way, but he realized that she was coming round on her undamaged side to engage again with her larboard battery. As a ship of war she looked more complete, with most of the rigging that supported her topsail intact. The most obvious advantage she had, that she could still manoeuvre, though 10 seconds watching showed that she did not have to do much, since the leeway was slowly taking her towards the Centurion's side.
"We must get back into action,"
Colborne hissed as he heard what was happening. "Lift your head, sir, and look along your deck. Then tell me we should get back into the action." Colborne did so, and had he been looking with as much attention as John Pierce, he would have seen the carnage. Men still not moving, probably dead, streaks of blood all across the planking, which was covered with a mass of ropes and blocks. Short against a bulwark with 2 sailors kneeling beside him, the mid quite clearly having passed out. Pierce could feel blood trickling down his cheek, and then he tasted it as it reached the edge of his lips. There was a dull pain in his head, but nothing he could not bear. That was the moment when the man he was holding upright became a deadweight, as the lieutenant, too, passed out. Then 2 of the Frenchman's cannon took Griffin low on the larboard side of her stern. There were no flying timbers this time, just the sound of shattering wood, and Pierce knew that the ship had taken a heavy blow. The question was, where? "Michael," Pierce called, "help me get him below. He needs a tourniquet on that arm. I think he has passed out from loss of blood." Wiping the blood from his own face, his eyes searched for Charlie and Rufus as he and the Irishman carried Colborne towards the hatch, and he was relieved to see that though both men looked shocked and confused, they were whole. That was when he spotted Gerson cowering right in the bows, and he yelled at him like the most stentorian boatswain in creation. "Move, you scum, or as God is my witness, I'll strap you to the muzzle of a carronade and fire you at the enemy!" "Now which God would that be, John boy?" asked Michael as he took the weight of the lieutenant and eased both him and his charge down the companionway ladder. Pierce followed him and passed by, heading for the stern, shouting down the hatch to the carpenter to get aft and assess the damage if he could. Standing in what had been Colborne's cabin, he was sure he could hear running water below his feet, but he could also see that the rudder ropes and the tackle that they ran through were intact. Michael was beside him again, whipping off the bandana he had on to protect his eardrums, wrapping it round Pierce's head just as another sailor appeared. "Carpenter says to tell you we can't get to the stern with too much in the way of stores to shift." "So how do I find out if we are taking in water?" The sailor looked shocked to be asked. Either that or the shock was at Pierce's ignorance. "You've got to check the level in the well to see if it's getting deeper." "Make it so," Pierce replied, thinking that at least sounded like a correct form of words.
Looking up, he saw above his head Colborne's sword, as well as a ceremonial sort of dagger. He grabbed both, and Michael at his heels, he made his way back to the deck, past the men laid out in what had been their living quarters. Midshipman Short had been fetched below as well. He was still in that sitting position, though the wad had been strapped on tight. There was a couple of hands aboard who knew a smattering of how to aid the wounded, and they, like so many of the crew, had gone to work without instructions. Not that they were doing much in the way of pain relief, their only medicine being the residue of that rum cask that Short had passed round before the engagement started. They were dulling their patients, not curing them. "Oh, Jesus, it's enough to tempt you to a wound," said O'Hagan, eyeing the cask. Pierce grinned, though it was a weary jest that followed. "Don't get drunk, Michael, you might get into a fight." "Sure, if I'm not in one already, pinch me." "Orders, sir?" demanded Latimer as Pierce's head came through the hatchway. Orders? He was in charge, and once he had got fully on deck, the unpleasant shock of the fact hit home, with any number of men looking at him silently, demanding to be told what to do, his pelicans included. To give himself a moment to think, he looked aloft to where the topmen were still working, securing what they could not repair. Then he realized that the firing had ceased, and given the near silence, he looked aft and asked the most obvious question. "Those cannon?" "They think they have seen to us," the old man replied. "Ain't shown since that last salvo." It had only been a temporary respite, and the two major vessels, with the Frenchmen now stern on to Griffin, resumed their battle with guns blazing and great swathes of smoke billowing up between them. It was obvious that Centurion was not giving as good as she was getting, obvious that in the contest in which her captain had been a fool to engage, she was losing, drifting away from Griffin, with the Frenchman doing likewise, though at a barely perceptible faster rate. Another head popped up through the companionway, that of the sailor who had checked the level in the ship's well. "We're taking water in fast, sir, round an inch a minute. Carpenter's asked for extra hands to get some of the stores shifted so as he can get a look-see, but I reckon the time he will take, he might be too late." "There's no time for that. Get some axes and stove in the planking astern on the lower deck. See if you can get to it that way." "Still need help?" "Latimer, you know the men. You detail them." The old sailor laughed out loud, though Pierce could only wonder at how anyone could see humour in the situation in which they found themselves. "Rank at last. Happen your old papa was right." Mention of his father suddenly brought back to Pierce that whole scene in Paris, that stinking, yelling mob salivating for blood, not just his father's blood, but that of anyone that their damned tribunal condemned. Ever since that day he had harboured a desire to retaliate, to do something to those vipers that would redress the pain and guilt he felt. From indifference he had moved over the intervening weeks to a visceral hatred of the French Revolution and what it had produced, the rule of the mob, the death of the innocent, the traducing of everything his father had worked all his life to promote. And ever since that day he had felt his own life to be worthless, something of no account, his self-respect so damaged that he had no care for his fate. Here he was, in a sea-fight with that same idea. Perhaps not the same people, but the dogma they represented. He had felt useless since that day, impotent. Now he had a chance to do something, one that might never recur again. "Will she answer to the sails?" "She will," Latimer replied, "but not with anything like grace." "She never had that, Latimer, but let's try and bring her round." "Top hamper's gone, so's you'll need to let fall the main course and set a jib to keep her head steady." Pierce smiled at the old man. "Make it so, Mr. Latimer. I will be back on deck before we are round." "Mr. Latimer!" crowed Michael. "Did you hear that, lads? We'll be tipping our caps to him now." Blubber could not be kept out of a jest. "One of those Frenchies gets your friend, Paddy, and he'll be captain." Pierce went below again to kneel by Lieutenant Colborne, who, still unconscious, lay flat out on the deck. Looking at the arm with a tight tourniquet on the upper part having stopped the flow of blood, Pierce reckoned it so damaged, with the two ends of bone poking out and trails of sinew, that it would probably have to come off. There was no one aboard with the competence to undertake that. He needed a proper surgeon, and casting his eyes about, Pierce knew he was one of any number. These thoughts running through his mind as around him the shouts reverberated as instructions were called down from the deck to be relayed to the men working the rudder. The thought that Centurion would have a surgeon was followed by one less welcome. So would the French 74. He could surrender the ship and quite possibly save some lives. That the idea was anathema to him was of little consideration. There were a lot of men aboard this ship, which might well be in danger of sinking, and it was, as had already been proved, certainly not of a size to engage the enemy. Really, despite his earlier thoughts of personal revenge, the decision was one for the whole crew, not a notion that the man he was looking at would approve of. Latimer had got Griffin round by the time he came on deck again, though with nothing sheeted home the ship was wallowing on the swell, so it was by looking over the bows he saw the deteriorating situation of Centurion. He did not have to be a sailor to see that she was in deep trouble, and that was getting worse by the minute. Little now existed above her lower masts, the bulwarks were totally stove in along their whole length, and the firing from her remaining guns seemed uncoordinated. The sailor's head came up again.
4 foot of water in the well, sir, and still making fast.
He should strike, Pierce said, nodding towards Centurion.
He won't, Latimer replied. He'll force them to board.
Why? There was a wry look on the old man's face as he replied.
Happen you don't know much about the navy you're in, Mr. Pierce, but we's not much given to packing it in until we're sure we's beat.
And our own crew?
Same.
While Latimer had been speaking, Pierce had been examining the situation, his mind strangely clear of all distractions. He felt a slight tremor run through his body, the same kind he had always experienced just before a fist-fight. It had happened to him as a boy and as a man, being something seen by him as a frisson of fear, a sensation to be ashamed of. Yet, as always, it had produced a heightened sense of awareness, the ability to not only see danger, but to anticipate it, and with it this time came a half-notion of a plan.
Centurion will be taken, will she not? Be a miracle if she ain't.
How long? Latimer thought before replying.
Half a glass, a whole one at the most.
And so will we.
Right after for certain, if we don't sink afore.
Can we get away?
Hard to see how, the way we're taking in water. Sinking won't be quick, but she'll sail even slower.
Surrender? Thoughts of the conciergerie surfaced again, that and the Bridewell, with a similar stench and sewage running through the straw if the River Thames rose. They would imprison him and the crew, and that was something he was determined to avoid. Added to that desire to revenge himself, it was a heady brew. Will the crew fight? Latimer looked at him then in a strange way, as if he had a notion of what Pierce was thinking.
That's what they're here for.
What would make that bastard draw off?
100-gun ship, which I take leave to doubt will suddenly appear.
Pierce's eyes were on the 18-pounder carronades, that and the line of 9-pounders, and then he looked towards the stern of the French 74, close enough now to pick out the name, Valmy, and some of the words Colborne had used earlier came back to him. Could it be done? To get the crew of this ship aboard their consort and so disable the enemy as to allow them to get clear? If it was possible, it was unlikely, but to Pierce it represented the only hope they had, so it had to be worth a try. Let's get under way. I want all starboard guns loaded and run out. An expression he had heard, one in common usage, ashore, came back to him, and he added, without really being sure it was the right thing to say, double-shotted.
It'd be better if you give the orders, not me.
Stay here. I will need you. Pierce stepped up to the small space that had once been the quarterdeck, now scarred, without a wheel or a binnacle, searching his mind for the words to use. Michael, a party on the falls to sheet home. Let's get some way on the ship. Blubber, sort out gun crews for the starboard battery, and make sure each has a good captain. He looked at Latimer then, who said quietly,
We need a party on the pumps.
He gave the orders, then added, as he saw the man he so disliked, Gerson, you lazy sod, get pumping! There was a pause while he thought through what else had to be done, things for which he did not need Latimer.
"I want the carpenter and all his mates on deck with as much of their spare planking as they can get out of the holds. Michael, once the sails are set and drawing, take your men below and fetch the wounded on deck. Lay them behind the bulwarks on the starboard side. Stand by with grappling irons, and every man who can use a musket and is not otherwise engaged, to get one ready for use."
"Christ, Pierce!" exclaimed Latimer. "You planning to board the Frenchie?"
"Wait and see."
The creaks and groans of protesting timber as HMS Griffin got under way, yards braced round to take the now helpful wind, were familiar and somehow strangely reassuring, so that Pierce felt a twinge of something approaching gratification as, with orders shouted below and with the men pulling hard, she answered to her rudder. It was not smooth. There was a certain amount of unwelcome yawing to and fro, but once he had got the course he wanted set, the bowsprit aimed right for Centurion's side amidships, he told them to lash it off to hold it steady. Looking over the bows, he could see the smoke-filled and narrowing gap into which he was heading. The high-pitched whistling sound was mystifying, until he recalled that he had already heard it twice that day. The Centurion's deck was being swept with grape, designed to kill anyone who sought to oppose the act of boarding. To the front of Pierce, the carpenter and his mates were hammering and lashing together their spare planking to make stretchers. One or two completed, the comatose wounded, Colborne and Short included, were being strapped on before being laid between the starboard guns. Others who could walk were shepherded to a place of relative safety, sat back to the bulwarks. Muskets were being primed and loaded, swords, clubs, and pikes laid ready, while aloft on the stump of the mainmast yard the topmen were rigging blocks with slings to lift those stretchers, so that once alongside Centurion they could try to get them aboard. Pierce had no doubt that few of them would make it unscathed. That applied to every man in the crew if what he planned to do came to pass, but at least it gave them a chance, for there was no doubt in his mind that the last place they would be safe once he had completed the task he had set himself was on this deck. If it worked, they might just live. If not, well, that was not a helpful thing to dwell on.
"They spotted what we're about," said Latimer, still by Pierce's side, pointing to someone on the Valmy's taffrail, gesticulating at them. "Reckon we'll take a salvo from their stern chases afore we get under 'em."
"Under them?"
"We's low, and those cannon a main deck. Once we's close, they won't be able to tip 'em enough to hit us."
"That's good to know."
"By that time," Latimer said with wry amusement, "we shall be close enough to the lower deck 32-pounders to look a right sweet target."
"I was hoping they would think us too puny to care about."
"Then you was hoping wrong, mate."
"What do you reckon?" Latimer's hand went to hold his chin, a sign that what he was about to say was speculation, which reassured Pierce since it matched his own lack of certainty.
"Our deck is about level with their lower guns, and they'll want the hull if they can get her."
"We're sinking, you said so yourself."
"Pity is, they don't know that, and with what they've got they can take out the bulwarks both sides quick as kiss my hand. But them stern chasers are first to worry about, and I reckon they will pepper us with grape shot."
A head came up the hatch, and a voice called out,
8 feet of water in the well."
The party on the rudder, and those pumping, was safe from that, but that was not the case for others, so he called down those aloft.
"Anyone not manning a cannon, get below. Everybody else, get behind the trunnion and keep your head down."
"Us and all?"
Latimer asked. Pierce moved to the rearmost larboard gun and sat on the deck, followed by the older man. Lying there they heard the whistle and swish as grape swept over the deck, the clang as some of it hit metal, the thud of straight shot and ricochets embedding themselves in wood. But he heard no screams, and that was what mattered.
"Everyone up!"
he shouted, getting to his own feet.
"Let's show the bastards we're alive!"
That brought forth not only sailors, but a load of shouted insults and filthy gestures aimed at the French gunners. Pierce went to the bows, then walked quickly back down the line of guns, ordering them elevated so that they would fire as high as they could.
"How are we doing, John boy?"
asked Michael. His tone was slightly jocular, the same as it always was when he asked that question. If the Irishman had any fear of what they were sailing into, he was not the man to show it, nor was he one to give a hint of any doubt about what his friend was doing. It had been the same every time they had gone into a fight before. The answer was a whisper. "I feel like a fake, Michael."
"Don't you believe it. Sure have I not said before you were born to be a bluecoat."
"Is we going to get out of this, Pierce?" asked Rufus, who was not too proud to tremble. Pierce patted the carronade they were manning, the last on the deck, and spoke with a certainty he did not feel. "Ask me when this has been fired." It was a tense Charlie Taverner who added, looking over Pierce's shoulder to the badly damaged Centurion, "Hope we have breath in us to do it." What could he say to them? Lay out the choices? Tell them they might accept being prisoners, but he would not? Add that he had only a vague idea of what he was about, and it was a hope rather than a certainty that they would survive? They had always burdened him with the making of decisions. Now he was making them without considering that they might think differently. And for once he felt no misgivings about doing so. Perhaps Michael O'Hagan was right. Behind him, Latimer was silently counting off the time with his fingers, and after he had gone across his hands several times, mouthing the pattern of loading and running out a cannon, he shouted, "Time to get our heads down again." Pierce complied, as did everyone on the deck, just seconds before another load of grape swept over. Apart from balls thudding into the masts, there was little sound this time, apart from the high-pitched whistle of its passing, until they heard the patter of a massive small shot hitting the wake of the ship. The armed cutter, with the wind coming over her starboard quarter, was making less speed as the water filling her holds slowed her down. Closing on the two near stationary ships, the gap was closing rapidly, now barely big enough for Griffin to enter, with the faces of musket-bearing Frenchmen leaning over the rail in plain view. Looking across the 30 yards of water, he could see the remnants of Centurion's gunners running out what was left of their main-deck battery, and within seconds the air was again full of sound, fury, and shot, of breaking wood, of screams, which partly masked the sound as a lead ball hit the planking by his feet. Looking down, he saw how close was the gouged wood, and he knew he had been lucky not to get it in the foot. "Those of you that have muskets ready and loaded, clear those sods off that rail above our head." Pierce went forward again as the guns were lifted, aimed, and fired quickly by the Marines, less efficiently by the tars, not looking at those returning fire from the enemy poop, for to do so would be useless. Providence would decide if he was going to take a shot. Going to the first 9-pounder and standing behind it. Each cannon would fire in turn, and since it was his scheme they were going to try and execute, he was determined to be the sole arbiter of when the flintlocks should be sparked. They were under the Valmy's counter now, close enough to touch the gilding on the stern decoration, and ahead Pierce could see the first of the lower-deck cannon that would do them damage, its black spout, with a wisp of hot smoke lazily exiting its muzzle, waiting for them to come alongside. "Sam, Matt," he called to the pair, "get some wads off the gunner and soak them in turpentine. We need something to set them alight as well." "Slow match'll do it for turps," Sam replied, as Matt ran below, shouting for help. Griffin was hardly making any way at all now, and she was definitely wallowing as the bowsprit crept past the Frenchman's stern. It went completely quiet. Centurion would not fire for fear of hitting Griffin, and the Frenchman was just waiting, knowing that the armed cutter was placing itself in between the two fighting vessels in an attempt to save her larger consort, waiting to blow her out of the water and out of the way before completing the day's work. As the first cannon came abreast of the Frenchman's rudder, Pierce pulled the lanion on the 9-pounder and jumped clear of the recoil. At a range of less than 30 feet it should have been impossible to miss the rudder, but miss he did, the ball flying past to land harmlessly in the water beyond. By that time, having told the first crew to scarper aft, Pierce was behind the second 9-pounder, this time more careful and more successful. The ball hit home, but even at such close range it did no more than create surface splintering on what was a substantial piece of timber. On down the line he went, seeing in the corner of his eye Sam with a pair of armourer's tongs, holding at arm's length a flaming wad. "Through the gun port, Sam!
Let's give the buggers on those cannons something to think about other than shooting at us."
The French gunners could have fired at the foredeck, but they must have realized, looking along the muzzle, with the larboard side deserted, there was no one to aim at. So they waited until that first 9-pounder came alongside, and assuming there must be a gun crew hiding behind the bulwarks, they blew both that and the gun asunder. The clang was deafening, and the 9-pounder and its trunnion, all 1.5 tons of it, flew across the deck and smashed through the larboard side and jammed there. The balls that had been in the garlands were likewise dislodged, and began to roll about the deck, making that noise so like thunder.
"This is no time to be thinking of mutiny," Michael called out as he stooped to catch one of the cannon-balls. A joke that brought forth a laugh from the men, a sound that increased in volume as he threw it hard at the side of the enemy ship. As the 32-pounder was withdrawn to reload, Sam threw his flaming wad through the gap, while Matt followed that with half a bucketful of turpentine, whooping with delight as he heard the cries of panic that his action engendered, for he knew, if Pierce did not, just how much sailors feared fire. Flames shot out of the gun port, and they heard a dull explosion as some powder, possibly a waiting cartridge, blew up. By that time, Sam had a second one going, and that went through just as Pierce fired the next gun, taking more splinters off the rudder, again ordering the gun crew aft as the second French 32-pounder fired a ball that went right through both bulwarks of the ship. Griffin began to grind along the side of Centurion, and proof of how tight the gap had been came when the bow of the armed cutter collided with and bounced off the side of the Frenchman. Already the grappling irons were flashing out, not yet to secure Griffin, but in readiness for when the order came. Hands were coming out of Centurion's lower ports offering to take the walking wounded, an offer of which Gerson, who seemed not to have a scratch, took immediate advantage. The curse that Pierce wanted to shout after him died on his lips, being pointless. With only a foot to spare, the ship ground on, crashing into one vessel, then the other, by which time 5 9-pounder balls had been aimed at the enemy rudder. If they weakened it, the 2 carronades did the real damage, the first of their heavier balls smashing it near in half, the second removing the lower section so completely that the enemy would be denied steerage way. That was when Griffin ground to a halt, finally crushed between the 2 ships, her bulwarks shattered and guns dismounted by the relentless fire of the enemy, half the cannon-balls on deck rolling into the scuppers. But Sam and Matt had done good service too, since many of the gun ports were belching smoke from a fire those behind the scantlings were struggling to contain. "Lash us off tight," Latimer called to those on the grappling lines. Colborne and Midshipman Short were already aloft by the time that order was given, hauled by the crew and hooked in to land on the larger ship's deck. Just as they disappeared, a rope hit the planking beside Pierce as the first of the French boarders dropped to their deck, with others trying to get at them from those gun ports free of flames. He might have died on the spot but for Michael O'Hagan, who stepped past him to clout, with another cannonball, an enemy sailor raising his short, heavy sword. The man dropped like a stone as the Irishman's hand caught his coat collar and pulled him backwards into a line that had been formed without his bidding, made up of all the crew that could hold a weapon. Now it was the turn of the enemy to face musket fire, as the men on the Centurion fired over their heads. It created a temporary respite and dropped several of them before they closed to fight hand to hand. The men of the Griffin began to scrap hard, to contest their deck. Their numbers, as those below came up, which must have come as a shock to their enemies, initially pushing the French back to their own ship's side. This was not what Pierce had in mind, for in the end there was no way they could hold off what the enemy could eventually throw at them, and there was precious little space on the armed cutter's deck for the assistance that could come from their consort. His idea was to get on to Centurion, and then, hopefully, Marchand could get that vessel, badly damaged as she was, away from the Valmy. If Pierce had read it right, and he had plenty of doubt that he had, without a rudder the Frenchman would be unable to chase, and once the British man-of-war was out of range, she could get both her crew and that of Griffin to safety. As for the armed cutter, she would no doubt sink. These thoughts came to him as he was heavily engaged on a deck that, even with the holds full of sea-water, rose and fell with the swell.
Colborne's sword might be a bit ceremonial, but it was a weapon with which Pierce was familiar. He knew how to use it to good effect, though it took several blows with the hilt, a jab with the knife in his other hand, and a couple of well-aimed kicks to deter those right in front of him and create the right amount of space to render the sharp blade dangerous and the thrusting point deadly. To his left he had Michael, formidable with just a marlinspike in his one hand, backed up by a left fist, while on his right he could use his longer weapon to keep those before Charlie and Rufus at bay. They were fighting too. They were just not doing so as effectively as the Irishman. Not for the first time in his life, Pierce was aware of how much action effectively cleared his brain. He saw things with clarity, and was able to parry thrusts aimed at him and return a blow that would wound and discourage his assailants. At the same time, he had a clear notion of the problem faced by the men of Griffin, as well as those who had come to their aid from Centurion. Once the wounded had been taken to safety, matters would come to a dangerous head, that there would be no time when they would be more vulnerable as the point at which they tried to retreat. Above their heads the small-arms gunfire was constant, muskets, swivel guns, and a few of the remaining cannon, as those on both line-of-battle ships' decks tried to back up their own side and harm the other, creating between them enough smoke to make Pierce feel he was fighting in a fog, that punctuated by shouts, curses, and screams, the occasional discharge of a pistol, with men falling and being dragged back out of the action. None of the lower-deck guns on either side could fire for fear of hitting their own, and so had been withdrawn, and that was the means of escape for the defenders, through the gun ports. Someone on the lower deck of Centurion had a brain, for from the side of each port came a couple of pikes to jab at the enemy through the mass of defenders, while from above came a shower of everything from spikes to fallen blocks, as well as small casks thrown at the attackers to hold them at bay, the whole obviously an attempt to create a space, not a very great one, for a safe withdrawal. "Griffin's back!" yelled Pierce, hoping that they would obey, for several seemed to have their blood so high up that they were oblivious to the need to get clear. Charlie and Rufus at least obeyed with alacrity, Rufus slipping through a gun-port and Taverner diving after him. Michael got to the port and, back to the hull, turned to renew the fight. All along the deck men were doing as they were bid, either scaling the side of the grappling ropes or using gun-ports and gaps in the scantlings to get to safety. Yet some of the others seemed oblivious to the danger. Latimer might be old, but it did not seem to interfere with his ability to wield an axe. Blubber stood, feet apart, two large hands swinging a short naval hanger like a scythe, and doing so with enough effect to keep clear a space in front of his substantial belly. Sam and Matt had abandoned their turps throwing to take up clubs, with which they were belabouring those in front of them. It was the sight of that pair that had Pierce searching for the cask they had been using, and he yelled at them to do his bidding. "Sam! Matt! Kick over that turpentine, then throw the slow match on it!" Time stood still for Pierce then, because the two could not easily disengage. He had retreated into the space between two pikes, so was now only concerned with the men in front of him. Michael occupied the space that separated him from the next gunport and was going to find it harder to get to safety. Eventually Matt got a boot to the cask, which turned on its side, then rolled across the deck, spilling its contents. Sam had ducked down, and only just survived a blow that took off his hat, exposing his bright blonde hair, without seeming to do much to the head underneath. The slow-match tub he just picked up and threw, his attempt to upend it successful, so that the burning linstock landed in the spilled turpentine. That took immediately, and created a blast of flame on the deck that made the enemy fighters take note, and in doing so they paused for that vital couple of seconds that allowed those opposing them to dive for safety. Pierce could not go until the last man was clear, and that proved his undoing. Suddenly there was a blue coat in front of him, and a fellow with a like sword who wanted a contest, either a lieutenant or a sous-officier. It was unwelcome for a man whose sole notion was to escape, especially when he realized that the lines to the grappling irons were being cut, which would allow Centurion to drift apart from the Griffin and Valmy. If he took this fellow on, and the delay was great enough, he would be stranded on this deck.
But he also knew that, close as the man was, and with the weapon he had, to turn his back on him was to invite a sword thrust that would certainly seriously wound him and might in fact kill him. There was no choice but to engage, and it was only when the two blades met that Pierce realized how much the level of extraneous noise had fallen. The clash of steel rang out like a pealing bell, that followed by the clear rasping sound of metal sliding on metal. Pierce had one hand to his back now, in a classic fighting pose, to aid his balance. But he knew he had a problem, in that he could not drive his opponent back, as to do so would take him forward into danger from a swarm of his fellow countrymen. He had no notion that they would hold back from maiming him out of some sense of chivalry. They would kill him as quick as they could. In the corner of his vision he could see that the two jabbing pikes, which had protected his flanks, were slowly moving back, evidence that the route to safety was going away from him, that indeed he was trapped. For all he was engaged, for all the thoughts of what was happening behind him, he could still see the irony in the fact that even if he killed the man he was fighting, he would be on his own with dozens more, and that could only end in one way. That the most obvious solution was to surrender and become a prisoner. It was that thought, and his own determination not to accept it, that fired his swordplay. Damning the consequences, he began to use his blade with more aggression, his lead foot jabbing forward to take his blade with it, the look on his opponent's face leaving him in no doubt that this sudden assault came as a surprise. There was another thing in the fellow's eyes, something John Pierce had seen before when fencing, the move from certainty of victory to the possibility of defeat. It was the moment for a swordsman to strike, that split second when doubt first surfaced, for that weakened both the arm and the resolve. The swift circle he made with his sword brought forth a desperate lunge from the Frenchman that exposed him. Pierce parried his thrust, flicked his blade to one side, and sliced down immediately, the tip of his sword cutting through uniform and flesh. The shock of that was all he needed for the kill, and those behind his blue-coated enemy knew that. Had he followed through, then he too would have died. Instead, he leapt back, reversed the sword, and threw it like a spear before jumping onto the bulwark and diving into the sea. Only those on Centurion, already 20 feet distant, saw the narrow margin by which he escaped thrusting pikes, thrown knives, and discharged pistols. Pierce did not. He was under water, swimming to deep security. When he surfaced, shook the water from his head and eyes, and began to swim properly, it was to a rousing cheer from the decks of the Centurion, and to an Irish hand held out of a gun-port, that of a man strong enough to bodily lift him clear of the water. He was hauled onto a dark, red-painted deck that yet showed many a streak of blood, to be faced by a black-faced lieutenant who took him by the hand and hauled it heartily up and down, creating, as the water ran off Pierce, an impression of a man working a pump. "Give you joy, sir! That was prodigious!" Then the hat was off his head. "I lift my scrapper in your honour, sir, and ask the crew to give you 3 times 3. Dripping wet and being cheered were, or Pierce thought ought to be, two mutually exclusive affairs. "Now, sir, join me on deck and let us see what we can do." "You are—" "Lieutenant Slattery, First Lieutenant, at your service." "Midshipman Pierce." "Captain Marchand?" Slattery took his arm and hauled him toward the companionway. "He's in the cockpit, sir, being attended to by the surgeon." "He will survive, sir, I am sure." "You are a mid, sir, not commissioned?" "No." "Then that raises your actions to an even greater degree of wonder, sir." They came up onto a deck that looked as if it had been swept by some mighty and furious giant. Guns were dismounted, though men were working to get them back in place. Ignorance of rigging did not prevent Pierce from seeing just how comprehensively it had been damaged. There was blood everywhere, though those that had shed it had been removed, and no doubt there had been bodies blown or thrown over the side. "Now, Mr. Pierce, let us see what our French dog is about." "Running for home, I hope." Slattery nearly whooped. "He would be, sir, if you had not shot away his rudder. As it is, once we get some canvas aloft and steer down on the swine, he is at our mercy. I expect him to strike as soon as we get across his stern." "Strike?" asked Pierce, who only wanted to get away from any more thought of battle. "Oh, certainly, sir.
Thanks to you, he cannot manoeuvre. I will take him under tow and pull him into Spithead, where we will not only be fated as heroes, but lie in our pockets with a pretty penny."
Pierce had been about to protest, to say enough was enough, but then he saw the eyes of his shipmates, pelicans and griffins, and he knew that they would never forgive him if he did so.
"So be it. You would do me the honour, sir, of demanding he strike, that is, if he understands English."
"There's no need, Lieutenant Slattery. I speak French."
"Damn me, sir, if you ain't a paragon!"
Hyperbolic in expression the Premier might be, but he was right. A jury rig that would allow them to steer was up within half an hour, and they bore down on the struggling Valmy. Having tried and failed to steer using Griffin's rudder, he had cut her loose to slowly sink, and she was down to her scuppers as Centurion swept by. There was a trading of shot, but the French captain did not wait to see his main deck swept from stem to stern with shot. As soon as the British man-of-war got across his stern, he struck his tricolor to avoid the carnage which was bound to follow. By that time the armed cutter HMS Griffin was gone.
"Come, sir," called Slattery. "I invite you to come aboard and help me take the captain's sword. Damn it! If they don't make me post for this, I swear I'll eat my best hat. As for you, sir, the world is your oyster."
It was a happy, if well-damaged, HMS Centurion that sailed up the Solent towards Spithead, with Valmy in tow, cheered from every beach they shaved, for news of the victory had preceded them, brought ashore by swifter sailing vessels, eager to be the one to deliver the news. The mere fact of a battle won so early in the war was enough to bring cheer to the crew, but to that was added the calculations being made about prize money. If there was one thing more pleasing than taking a merchant vessel, it was, in addition to the glory, the capture of an enemy warship, especially one on which the damage, though severe, was well worth the cost of repair. The only thing more valuable was the capture of a Spanish plate ship, which might set a man up for life, but a French 74 ought to be good for 2 whole years' wages to the lowest landsman. There was, of course, the vexed question of the capture being a joint one, which would keep the prize agents and the lawyers busy for a while, but there was many a discount house ashore that would be happy to buy the tickets of the cruise so they could spend their money before it was actually paid out. Such joy was not, however, universal. Quite apart from the severity of his wound, which had seen him lose his arm, the question of Colborne's actual rank had been raised by Captain Marchand. He insisted that Colborne was not, in the true sense of the word, a captain, and therefore had no entitlement to the full share of his 2/8. He wanted to downgrade him to the sum set for the sea lieutenants. This would mean HMS Griffin's commander sharing an 1/8 with 6 others. All the surviving lieutenants from Centurion, added to her marine captain, the master, and the surgeon who had lopped off his shattered limb. Naturally Colborne, who saw it as an attempt to rob him, even in constant pain and sometimes quite feverish, had disputed this. He had already written the letter that would be delivered to his commodore at Lymington. That officer could be relied on to get involved, and likewise dispute with Marchand's admiral at Spithead about a division of the spoils due to superior officers. Pierce tried not to think about it, for he was in the 4th class for distribution, which meant the gunners and carpenters of both vessels would get more. He was lumped in with the Centurion's mids and the surgeon's mates. Whatever it was, and it would be no fortune, was good enough. He was heading for shore, where he was sure the crew of the armed cutter would be put ashore. With luck, he and his trio of pelicans could get clear of the seaport and away from the navy. What he would do then, his promise fulfilled, would have to wait. Meanwhile, having been accommodated in the midshipman's berth, he had to put up with a level of discomfort as bad as the lower deck of Griffin. Worse, there was a 20-year-old senior midshipman called Burkett who got on his nerves so much that he wished Short would leave the sick bay, where he was comfortable, and relieve him of some of the burden of dealing with the man.
"I have no idea what sort of thing passes for proper behaviour aboard an armed cutter, Mr. Pierce, but on a ship like Centurion it is not done to fraternize too closely with ordinary seamen." Pierce looked up from the dirty pewter plate that had been set before him by the scruffy servant, aware that the man who had said those words was referring to the way he talked to the men who had just fought alongside him. That was bad enough in Burkett's eyes, but the intimacy he showed towards Michael, Charlie, and Rufus really got under his skin, the whole compounded by the way Pierce ensured that the Griffins were not subsumed into the Centurion's muster and put to work as ordinary crew members. What he saw pleased him even less than what he heard, for Burkett had a high colour, a flaring nose, and thin lips over a pinched and unsmiling mouth. The man reeked of disapproval in all he did and said, made worse by his tone of voice, which he used to force home the fact that he was well-born. The rest of the table, the surviving mids, 4 youths of varying ages, for 2 had been killed, were looking at their own plates. Being scared stiff of Burkett, they were not about to tell John Pierce if they agreed with that statement or not. "I shall take care not to have any contact with ordinary folk, Mr. Burkett, but the men from Griffin are anything but that, I'm sure you would agree." "I find I cannot, sir. A common seaman is a common seaman." "Then I can only assume that you have less than perfect eyesight." He saw Burkett swell to protest, but added before he could speak, "And no discernment either, and that means you will probably lack the qualities necessary to make a good officer." "Damn you, sir, how dare you!" Pierce was furious, for this was not the first time Burkett had sought to chastise him, so he took matters to the limit. "I may dare to repeat it, sir, in public and off this ship, and leave you to decide how to seek redress." "Captain's compliments, Mr. Pierce, and he would like you to join him in his cabin." Pierce thanked the steward who had popped his head in and stood up, waiting for a second to allow Burkett to accept his challenge. The moment passed. He took his leave, and as soon as he was out of sight, cursed himself. Why allow nobody like that to rile him so? In the captain's cabin he found a pale Lieutenant Colborne and a florid-faced Captain Marchand, who seemed to him like an older version of Burkett, a well-connected buffoon. He had been to dinner in this cabin several times while Colborne was convalescing. Marchand, with his arm in a sling, did not impress him at all. He made great play of his need to have his food cut up for him, continually making the same joke about it being damned hard to think of fishing, one that his own officers, led by Slattery, laughed at uproariously, regardless of how often they heard it repeated, their open sycophancy quite sickening. Naturally, the captain and officers of the Valmy were guests, and Pierce suspected his presence, well below the salt, had more to do with his facility in French than any desire to elevate him above his station. The enemy sailors had no English, and conversation was dull and stilted, good manners preventing any mention of the recent action. It would never do to discuss that in the presence of those who had suffered defeat, even if they were, in the eyes of their hosts, men who had a dubious claim to their rank, having only achieved it because better men had fled. Pierce did nothing to help. He was not about to tell the enemy either how he had learnt their language, or anything about what had happened in Paris, and he made no secret of the fact that he despised them. "We will moor the ship within the hour, Pierce," said Marchand, patting the thick and sealed dispatches on his desk, one of which Pierce had written at Colborne's dictation. "Then these have to go to Lord Howe." "Yes, sir." "He has already sent a boat, and the officer on board that assured me we would receive a warm welcome." There was a pause when he looked questioningly across the table, but since his other visitor did not speak, he added, "And I have prevailed upon Lieutenant Colborne that you should accompany us ashore." Pierce looked at Colborne, who refused to meet his eye, which made him wonder at his previous distant behaviour. Visiting him in the sick-bay, writing that dispatch, he had put that down to the pain of his wound and the uncertainty he might have about his future. Perhaps it was more than that. Perhaps, with some glory in the offing, the last thing he wanted, knowing that he had been unconscious for most of the time, was the presence of the man who had actually secured it. "Before that, sir, I have a favour to ask." Marchand fixed him with bulbous eyes. "Which is?" "There are certain men aboard the ship, sir, who are illegally pressed into the Navy." He wondered whether to add, "as I was myself," but decided against it.
"Is this your tedious pelicans, Pierce?" snapped Colborne.
"It is, sir," he replied, still looking at a mystified Marchand. "I would want them released."
"Can they prove their impressment was illegal?"
"I can swear to it, sir."
"Then I dare say you can take it up ashore."
Then the captain beamed at him.
"I doubt you will be denied anything for which you ask."
The only sound was that of Colborne sucking hard on his teeth.
"A damn fine show, sir. You are a credit to the service,"
said Lord Howe, commanding admiral of the Channel Fleet, repeating himself for the umpteenth time.
"Hear him, hear him!"
Pierce was standing in a room full of admirals and captains when the king's messenger arrived. The place was awash with glittering gold epaulettes. The numerous ships in the Spithead anchorage had emptied so that all the senior officers could be ashore to greet the returning heroes. Led by Howe, there was a veritable plethora of lords and knights. Marchand was basking in their admiration, Colborne in their commiserations at his condition, this while they were all at pains to assure him that his unfortunate wound in no way diminished the role he had played. He commanded the Griffin, and it was to his credit that he had taken aboard as a volunteer a young man of such a stripe as Midshipman Pierce. Under the deluge of such praise, the lieutenant had mellowed somewhat.
"Well,"
said Lord Howe, to whom the message had been given,
"you are required at the palace. This is an order for you, all three, to attend upon his Majesty at tomorrow's levee."
"Then I suggest," said another admiral, "that they best shift." Howe looked at Colborne and Pierce, his roomy old man's blue eyes not happy.
"They must make a visit to the tailor first. We can't have them going into the presence of the king looking like tramps."
Suddenly the old man became solicitous.
"Mr. Colborne, are you up to such a journey?"
Pierce had to stop himself then, for he nearly burst out laughing, sure that Colborne would crawl over broken glass rather than miss such an opportunity. But then did he want such a thing? Given his history, what was he doing, even contemplating walking into the presence of royalty? Then he had an idea. It was a golden opportunity to tell Farmer George the result of that warrant, which had placed both him and his father in jeopardy, to tell the king that he had, ultimately, been responsible for the beheading of a man merely for expressing his opinions. But prior to that, he had a request for Lord Howe, one that he delivered out of earshot of any of the others present. The old man listened and replied,
"Leave their names with my aid, and I will see to it."
If it had been a glittering array of senior officers at Portsmouth, it was as nothing to Windsor. The King's audience chamber was crowded with generals as well as admirals, politicians in silks, lords in satins, ladies of all ages, of beauty and aged ugliness, in gowns and turbans of a cost to keep a poor man for life, all trying to look as though the chill from the stone walls of Windsor Castle and the lack of a fire to warm them had no effect. John Pierce, dressed from head to foot in new clothing, stood well apart, rehearsing what he was going to say to George of Hanover. Head down, concentrating on that, he was unaware that he had been approached until the smell of expensive perfume filled his nostrils. Suddenly, mentally, he was back in Paris, in a salon a lot warmer than this, surrounded by beauty and brains. "And who, might I ask, are you?" Pierce looked up into the face of a very beautiful woman, and automatically gave her a slight bow. "John Pierce, midshipman." "Ah, the hero of the hour." It was false, he knew. This lady had known who he was before she came close. The midshipman who not only saved one warship, but helped to capture another. "I was not alone." "How delightfully modest." "May I ask to whom I am speaking?" It was Marchand who provided the answer, coming towards the pair. "Lady Annabel, I see you have met our hero." "I have, Captain Marchand." Then she looked Pierce up and down in a way that no lady had done since Paris, the final look leaving no doubt that she was pleased with what she saw. John Pierce felt his blood begin to race as she continued, "As you know, Captain Marchand, I am having a little dinner tonight, a celebration of your victory. I would be most disappointed if you did not fetch along our young Lysander." How old was she? It was hard to tell, but even under a fair degree of finery he could discern a very pleasing figure, and her bosom, half covered with a jewelled necklace, was very inviting. His plan, once this levee was over, and if he avoided being thrown into a cell for insulting the king, had been to make haste back to Portsmouth to get his friends off the Centurion. But one day would make no difference. "I would not only be delighted to accept, milady, but I would consider it an honour." "My," she replied in an arch but amused way, "not only brave, but with graceful manners." She was gone, with Marchand speaking softly into his ear. "Best watch yourself there, lad. Lady Annabel Fitzherbert is one to eat up such as you. There's a bit of blue blood in those veins, though on the wrong side of the blanket." Pierce was thinking how pleasant that would be, to be eaten up, especially for a man who had been deprived as long as he. The last woman to affect him in this way had been Berkeley's wife, Emily. He was rolling her name and the image of her beauty around in his mind when the entrance of the king was announced. It took an age for the monarch to get round to his part of the room, and before that he had seen fit to rail loudly at his sons for their manifest failings. But finally, having spoken to all the courtiers that required a word, he turned to his sailors. He was shorter than Pierce had expected, rather plump, with that Hanoverian nose dominating his ruddy face.
"Well, Marchand, a fine show, what?"
"A most pleasing result, your Majesty."
"Tell me."
Marchand was brief. As he had told both Pierce and Colborne in the coach that brought them to Windsor, the king, whom he had met many times, was not a patient man. Story told, in which he flattered his own actions more than others, he turned and said, "Allow me to introduce to you Lieutenant Colborne, the captain of HMS Griffin, who so nobly aided me and my ship in the capture." The king leant forward and looked into Colborne's face.
"An arm, Colborne? A stiff price, what?"
"Well worth paying, sir," Colborne replied, his voice gruff through nerves.
"Well, I shall make sure it is. What? Those devils at the Admiralty will find you something to your credit, or answer to me."
Then he spun round suddenly and shouted,
"Chatham!"
The man who responded did so without haste, approaching the king and giving him a courtly bow. Stood up again, Pierce thought he looked like a drinker, his face carrying that excess flesh which was a sign, that and his eyes which were rather watery, as though he had slept badly.
"Your Majesty."
"I hope you're going to give this poor devil a ship."
"His commission as captain has already been posted. As soon as he is recovered, so I am sure we will find him suitable employment."
"And this, your Majesty," said Marchand, "is the real hero of the hour. It was he, manning each gun himself, who shot away Valmy's rudder. I doubt we would have enjoyed success without his intervention. Indeed, I must admit the outcome could have been in doubt." "Pierce!"
This was said before Marchand could introduce him, his voice becoming very emphatic.
"Son of the late Adam Pierce."
That set a buzz of conversation going, and as the king turned to silence it, Pierce got a view of Lady Annabel, and her lips, slightly parted, seemed to be inviting him. Or was it his imagination? Concentrating on that, he failed to control his conversation with the king, who, with his back to Pierce, was speaking to Chatham again.
"A lieutenancy would not go amiss as a reward, Chatham. What?"
"If the young man has the required sea time, your Majesty, I am sure it will be a mere formality."
"Sea time be damned, sir. Lad's a fighter, what? Plain as the nose on your face."
"The service has rules, your Majesty."
"The service, sir, is the Royal Navy, and I, sir, am the king."
The voice began to rise as he continued, and Pierce wondered if he was going to lose control of himself. Certainly he had created a few worried faces.
"And if I am the king, sir, and the navy is royal, then they are beholden to me, are they not?"
Another courtier stepped forward, his voice emollient. Shorter and slimmer than Chatham, he was younger-looking, more elegant, but yet there was a definite likeness. "If it is your wish, sir, then it will be so, rest assured."
"Make it so, Mr. Pitt! Make it so! What?
John Pearce opened his mouth to tell the king about his father and damn the promotion, but the monarch had gone, and all he got was a view of his disappearing back. Then he was face to face with Pitt. "Did I hear your name aright?" The question was softly posed. There was no rancour or threat in it, which forced Pearce to reply in kind. "Then let me say I was sorry to hear of the way your father died. It was monstrous." "Which is what I wanted to tell the king. If he had not been driven from the country, he would still be alive." "Don't be hard on King George, young man," Pitt said. "If anyone deserves your anger, it is I, William Pitt, First Lord of the Treasury, at your service. I can see in your eyes a flash of hate, which I dare say I deserve. But rest assured, if I did anything regarding yourself and your late parent, it was for the safety of the nation."
"That sounds like an exaggeration."
"It may sound like it, but it is not. How do you think I feel about this war, Mr. Pearce? About the lives that will be lost, quite apart from the cost in money? Before you finally decide I am destined for hellfire, ask yourself this. When you felt threatened in that fight that has brought you here, did you think about the men that died so you could stay alive, on both sides?"
"It is not the same."
"Please do not presume to tell me what I constitute as a threat to my life, my well-being, and that of the country. You will have your lieutenancy, Mr. Pearce."
"I don't want it."
"It matters not. The king has willed it, and we do our utmost not to create difficulties in that area, since with his Majesty one has no idea where it would lead."
Clearly Pitt was referring to the king's mental state, which must be more delicate than the nation knew.
"And if you want a place, write to me and I will ensure you get one. It is the least I can do, for although I do not expect you to believe me, your father is on my conscience. Now, why don't you mingle? It might take that very sour look off your face."
"Perhaps I can help," said Lady Annabel, who had again approached unseen. Pitt bowed and walked away. That smile was on her lips again, and the Pearce blood was reacting.
"Promotion? That is something which should be celebrated. And here I am asking myself what I can possibly gift you that would be reward enough."
It was 2 days before John Pearce could tear himself away from the arms of Lady Annabel Fitzherbert, and if he had felt twinges of guilt at the delay in setting his pelicans free, he had also enjoyed rediscovering elegant life and the pleasures of the bedchamber. Dressed as a lieutenant in a uniform bought for him by his wealthy, gracious, and sensuous paramour, he coached to Portsmouth alone in one of her husband's well-sprung carriages, which he commanded to take him straight to the naval dockyard. There he requested a boat to take him out to Centurion, now surrounded by other vessels and scaffold, as her damaged upper works were repaired. He came aboard to be greeted by that supercilious sod Burkitt, who, when he saw his new uniform coat, went puce with envy. "I have come for my men, Burkitt," he said, gilding the lily slightly as he added, "on the express orders of Lord Howe, from whom I presume you have had some communication. Please be so good as to send someone for them."
"Which men?"
Pearce had some pleasure in forcing him to say sir. "Their names are O'Hagan, Taverner, and Dommett."
"From HMS Griffin?"
"Where else, man?"
Burkitt looked at the ceiling, but his face belied the words that followed.
"Then I am sorry to have to inform you, sir,
that the entire crew of Griffin was shipped into HMS Leander, which was short-handed. They are now at sea, on their way to the Mediterranean. Author's Note: The events and characters in this novel are entirely fictional, but the conclusion has a basis in fact. Although it took place in an earlier conflict, there was an occasion when a midshipman, the only officer left standing on the deck of a small ship in the middle of a desperate action, interposed his craft between that of a British ship of the line and an enemy vessel, saving the former from certain capture at the cost of the destruction of his own ship. As a reward for his gallantry, and on the express orders of the King, he was promoted lieutenant without being required to sit an examination. You have been listening to A Shot-Rolling Ship by David Donachie, read by Peter Wickham. Thank you for listening to this recording from Soundings.